Welcome back to Animal Quests. I'm Austin, and today we're looking at what happens when people start treating powerful predators like oversized pets. From a millionaire who kept provoking a chained brown bear until the animal finally snapped, to a miscommunication that left a zookeeper trapped alone inside a grizzly enclosure. It was April 17th, 2016, in rural Brenham, Texas. The farm seemed calm under the midday heat, unaware that familiar routines between an owner and her stallion were quietly drifting toward a fatal turning point. June Carter, 38, ran a modest homestead where she kept a few chickens, a backyard garden, and a single stallion named Rowdy. She worked part-time at the county feed store and kept the property herself, treating the animals as companions rather than livestock. Rowdy had been hers since he was a colt. She'd raised him from weaning, trained him herself, and registered him in her name. Neighbors described her as hands-on and deeply attached. She groomed him daily, hand-fed treats, and preferred riding alone down quiet dirt lanes. The relationship was affectionate and familiar, and June's handling reflected years of trust that, over time, softened formal boundaries between owner and animal. She couldn't afford professional trainers, but Rowdy responded to her calmly, so she relied on their long bond. He lived in a small stall behind the barn, close enough for her to check on him throughout the day. He wasn't a working horse. He was her personal pet and companion. The barn was warm with hay and dust, and the narrow alley near his stall left little space to avoid a sudden push if he moved forward unexpectedly. Adult stallions are powerful animals, well over 1,000 pounds in large breeds, with a low center of gravity and strong hindquarters built for forward momentum. They can shift weight quickly and brace a flank against a surface to apply unrelenting pressure. When triggered, a stallion's natural forward thrust is slow but overwhelmingly heavy. It does not require speed to cause crushing force against a fixed object. Inexperienced handling, blurred human-animal boundaries, or misread body language can quickly turn a routine interaction into a dangerous entrapment. That spring, Rowdy grew more restless at feeding time, pawing at the stall floor and nudging June's legs when she delayed. Neighbors noticed him trailing her closely, and once saw him shove a gatepost during a brief dispute over fencing. June dismissed it as stubbornness. That morning, returning late from the feed store, she entered the narrow alley, unaware that Rowdy's posture had tightened behind her. As she bent, Rowdy moved forward with a steady, forceful step. The stallion's shoulder struck the small of her back, driving her weight forward so that she stumbled against the stall frame. The impact was not dramatic in sound, but it was decisive in force. June's torso met the wooden post, and Rowdy continued to press, angling his massive chest and neck in a slow, sustained shove, rather than repeated blows. Her arms hooked for support on the stall door. Her feet scrabbled for purchase on uneven straw. The neighbor, Eli, who was repairing a fence 10 yards away, heard a dull thud and a low, distressed sound. He looked up to see Rowdy braced, head lowered, body angled as he pushed June back against the stall wall. June tried to step to the side, but the alley's width allowed only minimal movement. Each attempt to lift herself triggered more pressure. Rowdy's mass did not surge so much as it settled, driving downward weight against her ribs and chest. The stallion's movements were steady, not frantic, an unrelenting application of force that compressed her torso against the timber. Eli crossed the yard and called out while grabbing a bucket handle to throw toward the stall in a bid to distract the horse. But the stallion's focus remained on the pinned figure. He reached the stable door and shoved at the animal's shoulder. Rowdy braced harder, shifting the crush point across June's chest. The compression impeded breathing. Observers later described her attempts to inhale as shallow, each breath harder than the last. June's arms went slack as rib motion became ineffective. Eli, joined by another neighbor, Ramona, tried to lever the stallion away by twisting a lead rope that had been looped on a nearby post, but Rowdy's weight and the narrow stall geometry prevented any immediate displacement. Within minutes, paramedics were on site after a frantic call. By then, June had lost consciousness. Medical responders performed extrication procedures and provided chest decompression efforts, but the prolonged compression had caused fatal internal trauma, multiple rib fractures, flail chest mechanics, and rapid internal bleeding. She was pronounced dead at the scene. June's phone was found on the barn floor with its screen cracked, an unfinished video file still open from when she had set it on a shelf before working. Her toolbox lay scattered. A few screws kicked loose during the struggle. Rowdy stood quietly in his stall, breathing heavily, but showing no predatory behavior when responders arrived. Witness statements and a brief, shaky neighbor video confirmed the slow, compressive force rather than a frantic attack. A veterinarian and animal control officers later determined the stallion's behavior stemmed from space and resource fixation, recommending transfer to a facility with experienced handlers. The coroner listed blunt thoracic trauma with internal hemorrhage as the cause of death. Local coverage remained minimal, noted only as a farm accident, but neighbors quietly adjusted their own barns. Wider aisles, clearer feeding zones, while the property carried the memory of a familiar routine that had turned irreversible within seconds. It was May 22, 2013, and the backyard of Tom Bradley's rustic log home in Missoula, Montana, was decorated with balloons and streamers for his grandson's high school graduation party. 12 family members had gathered to celebrate the milestone, including Tom's elderly parents, his adult children, and several young grandchildren who played on the wooden swing set he had built years earlier. Hidden deep in the forested section of his 40-acre property was the large enclosure where Buster, a 300-pound black bear, had lived for the past 3 years after Tom illegally rescued him as an orphaned cub from the wilderness surrounding their mountain home. At 55, Tom was a recently retired logger who had spent his career working in Montana's vast forests, his deep connection to wildlife leading him to take in the orphaned bear cub, despite knowing he lacked the required wildlife rehabilitation permits and proper documentation for legal possession. Tom's wife had initially opposed keeping Buster, but her husband's gentle nature with animals and his success in raising the cub had gradually won her over. The bear had become a beloved family member, with Tom's grandchildren growing up watching their grandfather interact safely with one of nature's most powerful predators. Though the family understood the need for absolute secrecy about Buster's existence, Tom had built an elaborate habitat for Buster in a remote section of his property, carefully concealed from neighboring homes and main roads to avoid detection by Montana fish, wildlife, and parks officials. Black bears are North America's most common bear species, with adult males weighing between 300 and 400 pounds and possessing incredible strength capable of breaking down doors and overturning cars. Despite their name, black bears can be brown, cinnamon, or even blonde in color, and they are omnivores with powerful jaws and razor-sharp claws designed for digging and climbing. Black bears can become extremely dangerous when defending food sources or feeling threatened, their speed and agility making escape nearly impossible once an attack begins. The graduation party had been proceeding smoothly, with family members enjoying Tom's famous barbecue while sharing stories and celebrating his grandson's academic achievements. However, Tom had been following his usual routine of feeding Buster during the early evening hours, a schedule he had maintained religiously for 3 years. Despite the ongoing celebration, Tom felt compelled to maintain Buster's feeding routine, believing that any disruption might stress the bear or draw unwanted attention if Buster became agitated. As Tom made his way to Buster's hidden enclosure, carrying the bear's evening meal of fish and berries, he noticed that Buster seemed more agitated than usual, pacing restlessly near the fence line and vocalizing more frequently. The sounds of the graduation party, combined with the presence of so many unfamiliar people on the property, had clearly stressed the bear beyond his normal tolerance levels. Tom entered Buster's enclosure carrying the plate of food, his familiar presence initially seeming to calm the agitated bear who had been pacing near the fence line. However, Buster's behavior had been changing over the past several months as he reached full maturity, his natural instincts becoming stronger and his tolerance for human presence decreasing. The combination of territorial stress from the nearby celebration and his evolving wild nature had pushed Buster beyond his comfort zone. As Tom approached with the food, Buster's demeanor suddenly shifted from cautious interest to aggressive dominance, his natural instincts overriding 3 years of human conditioning. The 300-pound bear charged Tom with explosive speed, his powerful frame covering the distance between them in seconds, while his massive paws struck Tom's chest with bone-crushing force. Tom dropped the plate of food as Buster's claws raked across his torso, opening deep gashes that severed muscles and arteries while his powerful jaws delivered devastating bites to Tom's head and shoulders. Buster's powerful jaws delivered deep bites to Tom's neck and head, while his claws continued to rake across his victim's body, tearing flesh and opening massive wounds that caused catastrophic bleeding. The bear's powerful swiping motions with his claws created devastating lacerations across Tom's torso and limbs. Tom's movements ceased within the first few minutes of the attack, as massive blood loss overwhelmed his system. Emergency responders arrived within 15 minutes of the first 911 call, but Buster's continued aggression made any rescue attempt impossible. The bear was shot multiple times after refusing to retreat from Tom's body, his death devastating Tom's wife, who had considered Buster part of their family for 3 years. Tom was pronounced dead at the scene, his massive injuries from deep bites, tearing, and catastrophic bleeding making any medical intervention impossible, even if help had arrived immediately. The incident shocked Montana's wildlife community and prompted discussions about the ethics and safety of illegally keeping wild animals, regardless of how young they were when acquired. Tom's death led to stricter enforcement of wildlife regulations and served as a tragic reminder that wild animals can never be fully domesticated, no matter how much love and care they receive from human caretakers. It was April 18, 2016, in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Indianapolis, Indiana. Spring had warmed the Midwest, and the tree-lined streets were peaceful as evening approached. Inside a modest 2-story home on the east side of the city, Daxby Trone prepared for a routine task he had performed countless times. At 39, Daxby worked as a forklift mechanic, a job demanding precision and respect for machinery. But his true passion lay in the basement, where he had spent years cultivating a private collection of exotic reptiles. The basement had become a controlled habitat with heat lamps, humidity monitors, and reinforced enclosures lining the concrete walls. Temperature gauges regulated each environment, creating microclimates for different species. The space hummed softly with heating equipment and water features. Among his prized specimens was a 14-foot Burmese python he believed he kept within regulations. Daxby had raised the snake from a juvenile, watching it grow from 3 feet to its current length over nearly a decade. He fed it regularly, documented its growth, and kept careful records. Upstairs, his wife and teenage son went about their evening, accustomed to Daxby's solitary feeding sessions below. The routine was so normal they barely noticed when he went downstairs. Recently, Daxby had noticed the python entering its shed cycle and refusing 2 meals. Not unusual, but the timing concerned him. The snake's behavior seemed slightly off, more withdrawn than usual. Its eyes showed the milky appearance that precedes shedding. A latch on the enclosure had bent earlier that week, though it still seemed secure. Daxby planned to replace it, but hadn't yet. As darkness settled over Indianapolis, he descended the basement stairs with feeding tools in hand, unaware he was about to make a fatal mistake. Burmese pythons are among the largest snake species in the world, native to Southeast Asian jungles and swamps. These constrictors have rows of backward-curving teeth to grip prey and prevent escape. When they strike, their muscular bodies coil with astonishing speed, exerting enough pressure to restrict circulation and breathing once wrapped. Pythons do not crush bones as commonly believed. Instead, they disrupt blood flow and breathing, depriving the brain and organs of oxygen. A snake in shed can be more defensive and reactive, its clouded eyesight increasing reliance on heat-sensing pits and vibration detection. Their feeding response is extremely fast, triggered by warmth, movement, and scent. Daxby's fatal mistake came when he opened the enclosure and leaned inside to present prey at close range, abandoning the feeding tongs and second handler protocol recommended for constrictors this size. Alone and within strike range, he created the exact conditions safety rules are meant to prevent. The python struck with explosive speed, its mouth opening wide as needle-sharp teeth sank into his forearm. Its jaws clamped down with a vice-like grip, anchoring to his limb. Blood welled from punctures. Before Daxby could pull back, thick coils wrapped around his upper torso. He tried to wrench free, but each movement triggered the python's instinct to tighten. More coils encircled his chest and shoulders, forming overlapping loops that contracted with relentless pressure. Each time he exhaled, the coils cinched tighter, preventing a full breath. His ribcage compressed inward as the loops locked into place. As the snake shifted, one heavy coil pressed across his chest while another forced against the side of his neck, reducing blood flow through his carotid arteries and restricting lung expansion. His attempts to pry the coils loose were futile against the snake's immense muscle. Oxygen deprivation built rapidly. His vision blurred and coordination failed. With blood flow to the brain reduced, he weakened in seconds. Within roughly half a minute, his strength gave out and consciousness faded. He sagged against the frame and slid to the basement floor, the python still wrapped tightly around him. Upstairs, time passed quietly. Feeding sessions sometimes took longer, especially after missed meals, so his absence didn't alarm anyone. Nearly 15 to 20 minutes later, his wife went downstairs to check, expecting to find him finishing the routine. At first, she didn't grasp what she was seeing. In the dim basement light, it looked like he was kneeling beside the enclosure. Only as she stepped closer did reality become clear. Daxby lay motionless on the floor, the python still coiled around his torso. Emergency responders were called immediately. Animal control and fire personnel secured the snake and freed him, but he showed no responsiveness. Despite resuscitation attempts, he was later pronounced dead after the scene was made safe. Officials launched an investigation, with animal control and exotic pet specialists examining the scene. The python was removed and later transferred or euthanized according to policy. The coroner's report confirmed mechanical asphyxia from constriction during a feeding response. Local media coverage sparked renewed debate about the risks of keeping large constrictors as pets. Daxby's family released a brief statement expressing devastation and requesting privacy, emphasizing he had loved his animals and never imagined such an outcome. It was February 14, 2014, and the frozen courtyard of a private estate in Almaty, Kazakhstan, would soon bear witness to what happens when a man mistakes captivity for domestication. Ruslan Bekov was a 49-year-old executive, managing pipeline logistics across Central Asia. His colleagues described him as gruff and efficient, a man who believed money could solve most problems and control the rest. He had purchased the brown bear cub 8 years earlier from a wildlife trader, despite the lack of proper permits, naming it Gosha and installing it as a curiosity near his guest house. Visitors were shown the bear the way others might display expensive cars or exotic sculptures. Ruslan's reputation for drinking was well known among his business associates. His weekends often began Thursday evening and ended Monday morning, a pattern enabled by his position and wealth. He kept Gosha chained to a concrete pad roughly 65 feet from the main guest house, secured by a galvanized expansion eye bolt set into the concrete pad he had installed himself. Estate maintenance logs showed 3 separate warnings over 18 months about the anchor's deterioration. Rust and freeze-thaw cycles had compromised the metal. A maintenance entry dated August 12, 2013 noted visible corrosion and recommended full replacement, but Ruslan had dismissed each concern. In Kazakhstan, the species found near mountain foothills and forested regions is the Eurasian brown bear, an animal adapted to harsh winters and long periods of inactivity that can conserve energy while remaining capable of sudden bursts of force. Despite years in captivity, they retain powerful forelimb musculature built for digging and striking, along with bite pressure strong enough to fracture large bones. That morning, Dina Salimova, a 38-year-old architect from Astana, was staying at the guest house for a development project meeting scheduled for later that day. She had arrived the previous evening and was drinking tea near a second-floor window when she noticed Ruslan walking toward the bear's enclosure around 7:15 a.m. His gait was unsteady, his movements suggesting he had not yet sobered from the night before. Gosha lay on the frozen ground, his breath visible in the morning air. Years of confinement had left him slow to rise in cold conditions. Ruslan approached within arm's reach and kicked at the bear's hindquarters, trying to make him stand. When Gosha remained prone, Ruslan grabbed the chain with both hands and jerked it backward repeatedly, each pull moving the bear's head but failing to rouse him to his feet. The ground beneath the anchor was still frozen solid, the concrete pad slick with a thin layer of ice that had formed overnight. The anchor gave way without warning. 8 years of moisture seeping into microscopic cracks, expanding and contracting with each freeze, had reduced the bolt to a fraction of its original strength. The chain went slack in Ruslan's hands for a single moment before snapping backward in a short recoil that caused him to hesitate, and Gosha lunged forward. Gosha covered the distance in 3 strides, his massive frame moving with surprising speed despite years of limited movement. The bear's right forelimb struck Ruslan's chest with enough force to lift him briefly before gravity reasserted itself. Dine saw Ruslan's face hit the concrete pad, his nose shattered on impact, teeth breaking loose, blood spreading immediately across the ice. Gosha dropped his full weight onto Ruslan's torso, driving the air from his lungs. The bear's jaws closed around Ruslan's left thigh, canines puncturing through denim and flesh to scrape bone. The bite lasted several seconds before Gosha released and repositioned, his jaws now clamping onto Ruslan's ribcage. Brown bears typically kill through a combination of blunt trauma and crushing bites. Gosha compressed and released repeatedly, each bite causing additional fractures and internal hemorrhaging. Ruslan attempted to crawl toward the guest house, managing to move roughly 6 feet before Gosha pinned him face down against the concrete. The final phase of the attack focused on Ruslan's abdomen. Gosha's teeth tore through layers of clothing and tissue, his head shaking side to side to widen the wounds. The security team had drawn their weapons and fired 3 shots into the air, lacking authorization to use lethal force against the animal and awaiting direction over radio. Gosha paused briefly at each shot but maintained his position over Ruslan's body. The attack lasted approximately 2 minutes from the moment the anchor failed. By the time Gosha finally moved away, wandering toward the tree line at the property's edge, Ruslan had stopped moving entirely. The head of security radioed for emergency medical response at 7:18 a.m. The ambulance arrived 22 minutes later, after navigating the estate gate procedures and icy access road. Paramedics pronounced Ruslan dead at the scene. Wildlife officials later that afternoon arrived with a veterinary immobilization team and tranquilized Gosha using dart-delivered sedatives before transporting him to a remote facility in the Tian Shan Mountains. Estate ownership transferred quietly to Ruslan's younger brother within 3 weeks. Local authorities cited insufficient licensing clarity regarding private wildlife possession, and no charges were filed. Dina Salamova returned to Astana the same day and declined all media requests for comment. It was September 6, 2013, when early autumn arrived at a wildlife rehabilitation center located in the interior of British Columbia. The morning temperature hovered around 50 degrees, with scattered clouds and calm winds creating ideal conditions for outdoor maintenance work. The facility specialized in rehabilitating injured wildlife, including several non-releasable bears maintained in permanent enclosures for educational purposes. Tavish Drummond was a 31-year-old wildlife keeper who had worked at the center for 5 years. He held a degree in wildlife biology from the University of Northern British Columbia and had previously worked at a national park conducting bear research. Tavish's responsibilities included daily care for the facility's 3 resident grizzly bears, including a 9-year-old female named Coda, who had been orphaned as a cub after her mother was killed by a vehicle. The cleaning protocol for bear enclosures required shifting animals into secure holding areas before any keeper entered the main enclosure. The system used manually operated gates controlled by levers located outside the enclosures, with visual confirmation required before entry. The facility employed 4 keepers who rotated responsibilities, making clear communication about which animals had been secured essential. That morning, Tavish was scheduled to clean Coda's enclosure, while his colleague prepared food in the facility's kitchen building, located approximately 100 yards away. The protocol called for the second keeper to shift Coda into the holding area before Tavish entered the main enclosure. The facility used a simple system to signal shifts, a laminated tag that was supposed to be clipped to the access door once the bear was confirmed locked in the holding area. The tag was stored on a hook beside the lever controls, and it prevented exactly this kind of assumption-based entry. That morning, the tag remained on the hook. Tavish did not check it, and the second keeper did not place it, each relying on the routine to carry the responsibility. By the time Tavish reached the enclosure, the only confirmation he had was a closed door and an empty sight line. Grizzly bears are among North America's largest and most powerful predators, with adult females weighing between 290 and 400 pounds and males reaching 400 to 790 pounds. Despite their bulk, grizzlies can sprint at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour over short distances. Their front claws measure 3 to 4 inches in length, designed for digging but equally effective as weapons capable of inflicting devastating wounds. Grizzly bears possess bite forces exceeding 1,100 pounds per square inch, with jaw strength sufficient to crush bowling balls. Bears in captivity often develop food-motivated behaviors, associating human presence with feeding time and becoming agitated when expected food does not materialize. Their intelligence allows them to remember and exploit routine patterns in facility operations. Tavish arrived at the enclosure at approximately 9:15 a.m., carrying cleaning supplies and fresh substrate material. He looked through the observation window into the main enclosure, but the low morning sun cast deep shadows across the far corner, where artificial rock formations created additional blind spots. Seeing no bear visible from his angle, he assumed Coda had been shifted into the holding area as scheduled. The holding area door appeared closed. What Tavish could not see was that Coda remained in the main enclosure, concealed behind the rock formations in the shadowed far corner. The second keeper had become distracted by a phone call regarding a new animal intake and had not completed the shifting procedure. He had assumed Tavish would verify the bear's location before entering, while Tavish had assumed the protocol had already been followed. Tavish unlocked the enclosure's entry door and stepped inside, closing it behind him according to safety protocols designed to prevent animal escapes. He moved toward the center of the enclosure, still unaware of Koda's presence. The bear remained hidden for approximately 30 seconds, a brief interval, before reacting to the unexpected human presence. Koda emerged from behind the rock formations with startling speed. Her movement was driven by territorial defense and possible food anticipation rather than predatory intent. In rehabilitation settings, bears often associate keepers with feeding routines and respond aggressively when surprised outside expected patterns. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Koda covered the distance in seconds, her bulk moving with the characteristic rolling gait grizzlies use at high speed. Tavish turned at the sound of her approach, but had no time to reach the entry door. The bear struck Tavish with her front paw, the force and extended claws tearing deep wounds across his back and shoulders and knocking him violently to the ground. As he fell, Koda bit into his upper back and shoulder area, her jaws clamping down with crushing force. The combined impact of the strike, bite, and the bear's weight caused severe trauma to his upper torso and spine, resulting in vertebral fractures and spinal injury. The second keeper stepped outside the kitchen building moments later and noticed sudden movement through the enclosure observation window. Recognizing the situation, he ran to the enclosure and activated the emergency alarm system. Loud sirens and flashing lights, designed to startle animals and interrupt attacks, filled the area. Koda released Tavish and moved away toward the holding area, reacting to the sudden sensory disturbance. Staff members waited several minutes to ensure the bear had fully retreated before entering the enclosure. Emergency medical personnel arrived by helicopter within 25 minutes due to the facility's remote location. Tavish was airlifted to a trauma center in critical condition, but died 3 days later from complications including infection and organ failure. The investigation identified the communication breakdown between keepers as the primary cause, leading the facility to implement radio-based confirmation systems and electronic monitoring displays showing real-time animal locations at all access points. It was November 14, 2015, in Tampa, Florida. The house appeared calm from the outside, but inside, rising tension and repeated arguments were quietly pushing a sensitive household pet toward an unseen breaking point. Trevor Marsh, 27, worked long shifts in a hands-on maintenance job, often returning home drained and irritable. He had moved in with his sister Marcy, 25, only 6 months earlier to save money during his training period, fully intending it to be temporary. Their arrangement worked on the surface, shared rent, shared chores, but underlying frustration simmered as bills fluctuated and schedules clashed. Marcy's green-winged macaw, Rico, was part of the house long before Trevor arrived. The bird occupied a large corner perch in the living room, a space Trevor had to cross repeatedly each day. He tried to keep his movements controlled, but his natural pace, quick, purposeful steps, sometimes startled the macaw, causing sharp vocalizations that only added to household strain. Marcy, who worked in a small dental office nearby, had raised Rico for nearly 15 years. The bird was deeply bonded to her, trusting her touch and responding to her voice. But he remained highly reactive to sudden changes in tone or movement. Marcy had registered Rico under the FWC personal pet permit years earlier, a requirement she renewed annually. Over the previous week, arguments had sparked between the siblings over utilities and scheduling. Each time a voice rose above normal conversation levels, Rico responded with wing flaring or loud squawks. Marcy noticed the behavior but interpreted it as typical macaw sensitivity. The landlord, who lived in the adjacent unit and often overheard household noise, had knocked twice in recent days to ask if everything was all right, but nothing seemed serious enough to warrant concern. The living room was small, with a couch along one wall, and Rico's perch by the window. Warm air carried faint bird dander and pine shavings despite the air conditioner. Outside, humidity pressed inward. Trevor moved through the tight space quickly while Rico shifted on his perch, feathers lifted in mild agitation. Green-winged macaws are large parrots with strong beaks capable of cracking nuts and exerting significant pressure when alarmed. Their instinctive responses rely heavily on environmental cues, changes in volume, body language, or sudden motion. When startled or overstimulated, they may launch from their perch and use a defensive bite to anchor themselves. While not inherently aggressive, Their size and strength mean a fearful reaction can result in serious injury. Rico's long-term bond with Marcy made him predictable with her, but less so with fast movement or unfamiliar body cues from others. Warnings had accumulated quietly over the prior days. Rico had begun flaring his wings more frequently, especially when voices escalated. He retreated deeper into his perch when Trevor passed through the room too quickly, often raising his head feathers in a display of uncertainty. Earlier that afternoon, while the siblings exchanged tense words over a miscalculated bill, the bird shifted repeatedly, his tail feathers flicking against the metal bar. The landlord paused on his porch when he heard the argument rise, though he didn't intervene. As the discussion grew sharper, Trevor stepped through the living room toward the kitchen, his tone shifting abruptly. That change, sharp, loud, and unexpected, was the final trigger for Rico's startled response. As Trevor moved past the perch, Rico launched into the air with a rapid beat of wings. The motion was sudden and direct, a flight path angled upward before dipping toward Trevor's face. Marcy saw the arc clearly. Rico's wings flared wide, his body leaning forward as he latched onto the soft tissue just beneath Trevor's left eye. Trevor stumbled, grabbing the side of the cage to steady himself as the macaw clamped down in a defensive grip. The pressure of the beak, designed to break shells and hard surfaces, drove sharply into the skin around the eye, causing immediate bleeding. Trevor attempted to pull back, but Rico held firm, his talons hooking lightly into Trevor's shoulder for balance. Marcy rushed forward with a towel, hesitating for a moment as she tried to avoid injuring the bird. Her indecision allowed the struggle to continue several seconds longer. Trevor's breathing grew uneven as he bent slightly, trying to reduce the angle of Rico's bite. His free hand remained braced on the cage, muscles tense. In the adjoining unit, the landlord heard the impact of the struggle and hurried through the shared entryway, entering the living room as Marcy finally wrapped the towel around the bird's body. Together, Marcy and the landlord secured the towel around Rico's wings and torso, easing pressure away from Trevor's face. With coordinated effort, they managed to detach the macaw's beak from the torn tissue beneath the eye. Rico, still wrapped, was placed inside a spare travel cage to prevent further agitation. Trevor sat against the couch armrest, holding a clean cloth over his eye while Marcy called emergency services. Paramedics arrived quickly, noting deep eyelid lacerations and corneal damage before transporting Trevor to the hospital, where specialists confirmed partial vision loss. Rico later underwent a behavioral assessment but stayed with Marcy under stricter guidelines. The incident remained private, mentioned only in a brief homeowner's memo. Trevor moved out months later, leaving Marcy with a changed living room and a lasting reminder of the event. It was July 4th, 2016, and the sprawling backyard of Randy Kowalski's modest ranch house in Zanesville, Ohio, buzzed with the excitement of the annual 4th of July family barbecue. Red, white, and blue decorations hung from the covered patio, while the smell of grilling burgers and hot dogs filled the warm summer air. 15 family members had gathered for the traditional celebration, including Randy's 2 teenage sons, his elderly parents, and several young cousins who ran around the yard with sparklers as the sun began to set over the rural property. At 43, Randy was a long-haul truck driver who had spent most of his adult life on the road, hauling freight across the Midwest to support his family after his divorce 3 years earlier. His love for exotic animals had started innocently enough with a few snakes and lizards, but had escalated dramatically when he purchased Saber, a 400-pound Bengal tiger, from a private breeder using money from a workers' compensation settlement. Randy had convinced himself that his bond with the massive cat made him special, often bragging to neighbors and coworkers about his unique pet that lived in the reinforced enclosure he had built behind his garage. Randy had been keeping the tiger illegally for 18 months, operating under constant threat of discovery by local authorities who had dramatically increased exotic animal enforcement following Ohio's 2011 Zanesville incident. Multiple neighbor complaints had already triggered 2 investigations, but Randy had managed to temporarily relocate Saber during inspections. Bengal tigers are among the world's most powerful predators, with adult males weighing up to 500 pounds and possessing the strength to kill prey much larger than themselves. These magnificent cats are solitary, territorial animals with razor-sharp claws that can grow up to 4 inches long and jaws capable of delivering a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch. Despite being raised in captivity, tigers retain all their wild instincts and can become extremely aggressive when stressed, threatened, or exposed to loud noises and unfamiliar situations. Randy had been drinking beer steadily throughout the afternoon, his judgment increasingly impaired as he entertained his visiting brother-in-law with stories of his adventures with Saber. The distant sound of fireworks from neighboring properties had been making the tiger increasingly agitated, his pacing more intense, and his vocalizations more frequent as the evening progressed. Randy's family members had noticed Saber's restless behavior, but Randy dismissed their concerns with the overconfidence that alcohol and familiarity had bred over the years. As the barbecue wound down and darkness began to fall, Randy's brother-in-law expressed skepticism about Randy's claims of having a special relationship with the dangerous predator. The challenge to his credibility, combined with his intoxicated state, prompted Randy to announce that he would demonstrate his bond with Saber by entering the enclosure and interacting with the tiger directly. The attack came without warning as Randy stumbled deeper into the enclosure, his unsteady gait and strong scent of alcohol triggering Saber's predatory instincts. The massive tiger launched himself at Randy with explosive power, his 400-pound frame covering the distance between them in a single bound. Randy had no time to react as Saber's massive paws struck his chest, driving him backward onto the concrete floor with bone-crushing force. Saber's razor-sharp claws raked across Randy's torso, each swipe opening deep gashes that severed muscles and arteries while his powerful jaws clamped down on Randy's neck and throat. The tiger's 4-inch canine teeth punctured through vital structures in Randy's neck as his body convulsed under the tremendous pressure. Blood poured from the massive neck wounds as Saber maintained his crushing grip, the tiger's powerful jaw muscles compressing Randy's windpipe and severing major arteries with devastating efficiency. The horrified family members screamed and threw barbecue tools and lawn chairs at the enclosure, but their desperate attempts to distract Saber only seemed to intensify his aggressive behavior. Randy's teenage sons recorded the attack on their phones before the shock overwhelmed them, their footage later becoming crucial evidence in the investigation. Police officers arrived within 15 minutes of the first 911 call, but Saber remained aggressive and protective of his kill, forcing them to shoot the tiger multiple times before they could safely enter the enclosure. Randy was pronounced dead at the scene, his massive injuries making any medical intervention impossible. The traumatic incident left his entire extended family requiring psychological counseling, with several relatives developing lasting PTSD from witnessing the brutal attack. The investigation revealed that Randy had been keeping Saber illegally, violating multiple state and local ordinances regarding exotic animal ownership that had been significantly strengthened following the 2011 Zanesville exotic animal tragedy. The incident prompted Ohio legislators to further enhance exotic animal laws and increase penalties for illegal ownership of dangerous predators. It was January 8, 2016, in the windswept landscape of County Mayo, Ireland. Winter had settled heavily over the western coastline, where ancient stone walls divided emerald fields stretching toward the Atlantic Ocean. The countryside was dotted with small family farms that had operated for generations, their weathered buildings standing against constant winds. Tabit Fane had called this rugged corner of Ireland home for all of his 62 years. His small farm consisted of rolling pastures, a traditional stone barn, and various outbuildings housing his modest operation. For decades, he had maintained a flock of sheep and goats, selling wool and meat to local markets. The farm was entirely legal and well-maintained, with proper fencing and shelter. Tabit took pride in his livestock, knowing each animal by sight and temperament. However, one member of his flock had become increasingly problematic over the past year. His breeding ram was a powerful male that had served the farm well for several seasons, siring healthy offspring. But as winter breeding season approached, the animal's behavior had grown more aggressive and unpredictable. The previous year, there had been incidents where the ram charged at fences and showed hostility during routine care. Family members who helped with farm duties had suggested replacing the aggressive ram with a younger, more manageable animal. They worried about Tabit's safety, especially given his advancing age. But Tabit was reluctant to part with an animal that had been so productive. The barn was a traditional Irish stone structure with concrete floors and wooden stalls. The ram was housed in a separate pen during breeding season to control mating and prevent fights. On cold January nights, Tabit would make late evening rounds to ensure all animals had adequate feed. As darkness enveloped County Mayo that night, Tabit made his way to the barn carrying feed buckets and hay. The The wind howled through gaps in the stone walls, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. A thin layer of frost had begun forming along the barn doorway and across the packed yard outside. He had no way of knowing this routine feeding would trigger a violent encounter. Rams are among the most dangerous animals found on traditional farms. Adult breeding males can weigh over 300 pounds and possess incredibly powerful neck muscles designed for head-to-head combat during mating competitions. Their skulls are reinforced with thick bone built to withstand heavy impacts. During breeding season, rams experience massive hormonal changes that increase aggression and territorial behavior. Testosterone levels surge, transforming normally manageable animals into volatile creatures. They become hypervigilant to perceived threats and may attack anything they view as competition. A ram's primary weapon is its charging attack. They can reach speeds of roughly 15 to 20 miles per hour, building dangerous momentum before impact, enough force to break ribs or knock a person unconscious. Their attacking strategy involves backing up to create distance, then launching forward with heads lowered and skulls aimed squarely at a target. Tabit's fatal mistake occurred when he entered the ram's enclosure alone and turned his back to the animal while carrying feed, presenting himself as an easy target during peak breeding aggression. The ram had been pacing restlessly as Tabit approached with the evening feed. As soon as Tabit opened the gate and stepped inside with the hay rack, the animal's territorial instincts triggered. The ram shifted to the far corner, lowering its massive head and scraping a hoof across the concrete. Focused on positioning the feed rack, Tabit didn't notice the warning posture behind him. Without further signal, the ram surged forward, covering the short distance in seconds. Its skull slammed into Tabit's lower chest and abdomen with crushing force. The impact knocked him completely off his feet and hurled him backward onto the concrete floor. His head struck hard as he fell, the sound echoing sharply through the stone barn. The blow left him stunned and gasping, disoriented from both the chest strike and the violent impact to his skull. The ram paced nearby, agitated, but the decisive damage had already been done. Tabit struggled weakly, attempting to draw breath as pain spread through his ribs and chest. The fall had likely fractured ribs and caused internal bleeding, while the head impact left him unable to regain his footing or call for help in the empty barn. Within minutes, his breathing became shallow and irregular. The combination of head trauma and internal hemorrhage steadily overwhelmed him as he lay on the cold concrete, the barn settling back into the sound of wind, shifting timber, and restless livestock in nearby stalls. When family members discovered him the following morning, the ram stood quietly in the opposite corner, its aggression long faded. The barn door creaked in the morning wind as they stepped inside, immediately sensing something was wrong. Tabit lay motionless near the pen entrance, the aftermath of the encounter stark in the pale winter light filtering through narrow windows. An investigation followed into the farming accident. Local veterinarians examined the ram and confirmed it had displayed heightened but not abnormal breeding season aggression. Investigators also noted that entering a ram enclosure alone during breeding season carried well-known risks among experienced farmers. The animal was later euthanized as a precaution. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma, resulting in head injury and internal bleeding consistent with a ram charge and fall. Local farming communities discussed the incident extensively, with many farmers quietly acknowledging how easily routine chores could turn dangerous without warning. It was March 14, 2015, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Miles Hargreaves' waterfront estate in Darwin, Northern Territory, where a decorative saltwater crocodile pond had become the centerpiece of his carefully cultivated image of frontier affluence. Miles, 61, had built his fortune developing luxury properties across northern Australia, specializing in high-end residences that blended modern amenities with what he called outback authenticity. The crocodile pond was his signature feature, a 40-foot oval enclosure licensed under a private wildlife display permit and stocked with 2 saltwater crocodiles, acquired through authorized dealers. Colleagues described Miles as a man who thrived on spectacle, hosting elaborate dinner parties where guests could observe the predators from an elevated wooden deck while sipping imported wine. The pond had been in use for 8 months when maintenance logs flagged deck issues. Between January and March 2015, 3 entries noted loose railing bolts and urged immediate repair. Miles postponed the work, citing scheduling conflicts. His pool contractor, Jalen Ortiz, warned weekly about wobbling posts and wood rot, noting one post splintering under pressure. The predators Miles kept for entertainment were among nature's most efficient killers. Saltwater crocodiles can reach lengths exceeding 20 feet and weigh over 2,000 pounds, with bite forces measuring about 3,700 pounds per square inch, the strongest of any living animal. These apex predators employ a hunting technique known as the death roll, using their powerful bodies to spin rapidly while gripping prey, dismembering victims with brutal efficiency. That Saturday around 4:30 p.m., Jalen arrived for routine maintenance and found Miles alone on the deck, leaning over the railing with a telescoping net to retrieve his phone 6 feet below, 1 foot braced on a crossbeam, his weight pressed against the weathered supports. Jalen offered help, but Miles waved him off. As the net touched the phone, a soft crack sounded. The rotted support post split under his weight. Miles pitched forward without a sound, his body weight carrying him over the broken railing in an almost graceful arc. He struck the water chest first, the impact sending up a spray that caught the fading sunlight. For perhaps 2 seconds, the pond remained deceptively calm as Miles surfaced, gasping and disoriented, his arms flailing as he tried to orient himself in the cloudy water. The larger crocodile, a 14-foot male estimated at 1,400 pounds, had been resting near the pond's eastern edge, roughly 12 feet from the splash point. The disturbance triggered an explosive response. The massive reptile surged forward with terrifying speed, closing the distance in seconds. Jalen, frozen at the deck's edge, reached instinctively for a long maintenance pole before stopping short, watching as the crocodile's jaws lined with conical teeth opened wide before clamping down on Miles's left arm. Miles went under immediately, pulled by over a ton of pure muscle. The water erupted into violent motion as the crocodile initiated its death roll, spinning with its prey locked in an unbreakable grip. Jalen could see flashes beneath the surface, the pale shape of Miles's body, the dark mass of the crocodile, clouds of spreading red. The thrashing sent waves against the pond's concrete walls, water sloshing over the edges onto surrounding stone pavers. After approximately 15 seconds of sustained rolling, the surface broke briefly. Miles's head appeared above water, his mouth open, his left arm still clamped in the crocodile's jaws, visibly mangled. Then the animal rolled again, dragging him under with renewed violence. This time, the submersion lasted longer. The water continued to churn for another 30 seconds. Brutal, methodical movements punctuated by occasional breaks in the surface where blood-darkened water flowed freely. By the time the disturbance finally ceased, 45 seconds after the initial attack, the pond had settled into an eerie calm. Miles's body floated face down near the center, his left arm nearly severed at the shoulder. The crocodile had retreated to the depths after securing its hold and no longer perceiving surface struggle. Jalen had called emergency services within seconds of Miles hitting the water and informed dispatch that a large crocodile was involved, prompting responders to prepare for a hazardous animal scene. Darwin's rescue units arrived 16 minutes later, but protocol prohibited immediate water entry due to the active predator risk. Miles Hargreave was declared dead at the scene. The subsequent examination revealed catastrophic injuries, near-complete amputation of the left arm, multiple compression fractures to the ribcage and spine consistent with the death roll, and drowning as the immediate cause of death. Blood loss and trauma would have likely rendered him unconscious within roughly a minute of the initial bite. The property was secured as evidence, while investigators reviewed maintenance records and contractor reports. The crocodiles were relocated to a government facility within 48 hours under Emergency Wildlife Authority order. It was November 19, 2014, when morning routines began at a zoological garden located near Dusseldorf. The autumn chill had settled over the region, with temperatures hovering just above freezing and heavy clouds promising rain before midday. Inside the Great Ape House, tropical conditions were maintained year-round, with climate control systems recreating the humid warmth of African rainforests. Hendrik Voss was a 43-year-old senior keeper who had worked with the facility's gorilla troop for 17 years. He had started as an apprentice keeper immediately after completing his education and had risen to become the department head. Over nearly 2 decades, Hendrik had developed particularly strong working relationships with the gorillas, especially the dominant silverback who had arrived as a juvenile during Hendrik's second year. The troop consisted of 6 western lowland gorillas, including the 380-pound silverback named Batu. The facility utilized modern enclosure design with multiple interconnected spaces, allowing keepers to shift animals between areas without direct contact. A vestibule system permitted enrichment delivery and limited maintenance, while animals remained in adjacent spaces, separated by reinforced barriers and transfer points. Protocol required the troop to be shifted into the outdoor enclosure, while Hendrik worked inside the vestibule, separated from the animals by steel mesh and steel frame transfer interfaces. Western lowland gorillas are among the largest primates, with adult males weighing between 300 and 430 pounds. Their arm span can exceed 8 feet, and their upper body strength is estimated at 4 to 10 times that of an adult human male. Despite their generally calm demeanor, gorillas possess canine teeth up to 2 inches long and hands capable of crushing bone. In captive environments, males may display aggressive or territorial behavior when stimulated or frustrated, particularly when structural features allow close proximity. Hendrik entered the vestibule at approximately 9:20 a.m., carrying bundles of fresh browse and several puzzle feeders loaded with fruit. The gorillas had been shifted outside, though Batu remained near a transfer window, observing Hendrik's movements. This behavior was routine and had occurred during hundreds of previous enrichment sessions. The timing mattered. Morning routines in the ape house often produced a brief spike in agitation when animals could see food items being handled, but could not access them. Batu remained close to the transfer window as Hendrik moved between feeders, tracking the motion and sound of fruit shifting inside the puzzle devices. In captive troops, dominant males sometimes redirect that stimulation into barrier testing behavior, especially when they have learned that pulling and shaking produces a visible reaction from keepers or changes the flow of routine. The vestibule barrier extended from floor to ceiling, consisting of rigid steel mesh panels mounted within a reinforced frame anchored into concrete. Near one upper corner, where a mesh panel met a steel support post and an access seam for maintenance, repeated stress over years of use had caused slight separation at the junction. The opening appeared within acceptable limits under inspection conditions but remained vulnerable under the kind of dynamic stress a large primate could generate. As Hendrik distributed browse material, Batu approached the barrier. The silverback grasped the mesh near the junction point and pulled, a behavior observed previously without consequence. This time, the force shifted the compromised seam. Records later showed that Batu had demonstrated similar barrier testing behavior on at least 4 prior occasions over the previous year, each time stopping short of structural compromise. The incidents were logged as routine dominance displays rather than infrastructure threats, and no reinforcement work had been ordered because the panel itself had not visibly deformed during inspections. The rigid panel itself did not deform, but the separation at the frame widened, creating an uneven triangular gap between the mesh and support post. Batu climbed partway up the barrier, using the framework for leverage, his weight prying the angled opening to several inches at its widest point. One of his hands forced through the gap, fingers finding purchase on the steel framework inside the vestibule. The escalation unfolded rapidly. Batu gripped the inner frame and pulled himself closer. Hendrik turned and moved toward the vestibule exit, located less than 8 feet away. Before he could reach it, Batu's arm caught him at the shoulder, fingers twisting into the fabric of his uniform with crushing force. The grip halted Hendrik instantly. Batu pulled him backward toward the barrier, the motion driven by territorial aggression rather than feeding behavior. The silverback bit down on Hendrik's upper arm, canines penetrating deep into muscle and fracturing bone. Additional bites followed in rapid succession to the shoulder and the side of his neck, the gorilla's immense jaw pressure crushing through tissue and severing blood vessels with each strike. Hendrik collapsed against the base of the barrier as Batu maintained his hold, continuing to pull him closer to the opening. Staff members activated emergency alarms and deployed fire extinguishers and noise devices from a safe distance. For over a minute, Batu maintained his grip before the intensifying disturbance caused him to release Hendrik and retreat toward the outdoor enclosure. Emergency medical teams entered the vestibule within minutes of the all-clear signal. Hendrik was unresponsive, having lost massive amounts of blood from compound wounds to his arm, shoulder, and neck. Paramedics initiated emergency treatment on site, but the severity of the blood loss and the depth of the neck injuries had caused irreversible damage. Hendrik was pronounced dead during transport to a regional trauma center. The investigation determined that the barrier junction had degraded over years of repeated manipulation by the gorillas, a pattern that routine visual inspections had failed to identify as a critical risk. The facility immediately reinforced all 8 barrier junctions with welded steel plates and eliminated any interfaces that could be leveraged from the animal side. It was September 3, 2016, in Bakersfield, California. The late summer heat settled over the neighborhood in a steady, heavy quiet, the kind that made the air feel slow. Nothing unusual moved across the backyard fences, yet small, familiar habits were already shifting just enough to set the stage for a preventable accident that no one fully recognized. Marcia Delton, 54, worked part-time as a bookkeeper and spent most afternoons tending to her small garden and the animals she kept as companions. She had adopted a sulcata tortoise named Buster 8 years earlier from an overwhelmed hobbyist who could no longer care for him. Marcia took pride in maintaining a routine, feeding, cleaning, and gentle interaction, believing her attentiveness had helped the tortoise settle into a stable, predictable life. Her backyard was her main sanctuary, and caring for Buster gave structure to her days, especially after shifting to part-time work the year before. Neighbors mostly saw Marcia moving quietly through her yard, carrying feed bowls or tending small patches of weeds. From her kitchen window, Aileen often caught glimpses of her daily routine and had recently noticed Buster trailing closer behind her than before. Marcia mentioned his appetite had grown with the heat, and he pressed against her legs at feeding time, a change she brushed off as seasonal. The yard itself showed signs of late summer: dry, uneven soil, pockets of turned dirt near the shed, and narrow walkways where shade barely reached. Spaces Marcia moved through without much caution. Sulcata tortoises, particularly adults nearing 70 pounds, are powerful herbivores with strong, stocky limbs and a natural tendency to push forward when navigating obstacles. While not aggressive predators, they can exhibit assertive food-seeking behavior, especially during periods of increased appetite. Their forward momentum can come quickly for their size, and once engaged in a pushing motion, they continue with steady, unyielding force, using their domed shells as leverage against surfaces or objects. Several warnings had been building in the days leading up to the incident. Buster's increased pacing before meals, the more frequent nudging against Marcia's legs, and the proximity with which he trailed her around the yard all indicated heightened food motivation. The uneven ground added instability, and the narrow corridor near the shed reduced her ability to move away quickly. Earlier that morning, Aileen had seen Buster circling near the shed for several minutes, an unusual behavior she interpreted as anticipation for feeding time. Marcia, carrying a metal bowl of chopped vegetables, seemed unaware of how tightly these small factors were converging. As she stepped into the shaded strip beside the shed and turned to lower the bowl, Buster surged forward with surprising speed for his size. His shell struck the back of her calf, knocking her off balance. The dry soil shifted beneath her feet, and she fell backward into the narrow space. Before she could rise, the tortoise advanced again, pressing his weight forward until her back met the wooden shed wall. Aileen, who had been rinsing dishes, looked out just in time to see Marcia's feet kicking against the dirt. Aileen rushed outside, calling out for Marcia as she crossed the yard. Buster maintained steady pressure, his front limbs braced and shell angled upward as he pushed. Marcia attempted to shift sideways, but the confined space between the shed and the garden bed left little room. Each time she tried to lift herself, Buster's weight pressed her down, his movements slow but firm. Aileen attempted to push him away at the shell's edge, but his mass barely shifted. Realizing she needed leverage, Aileen grabbed a shovel leaning near the garden bed. She wedged the handle between Buster's shell and the shed wall, applying steady pressure. After several seconds, the tortoise shifted just enough for Marcia to pull one leg free and slide sideways out of the narrow corridor. Buster continued to press forward for a moment before settling, his attention fixed on the dropped bowl. The yard fell quiet again once the immediate struggle ended. Marcia remained on the ground, breathing unsteadily, unable to put weight on her left side. The impact of the fall and the force of Buster's shell had left her in significant pain. Aileen called emergency services, and paramedics transported Marcia to the hospital, where scans revealed a fractured hip and internal bruising. She survived, but required prolonged rehabilitation. Animal control and a local rescue organization later assessed Buster, determining that his behavior stemmed from strong food motivation rather than aggression. He was rehomed to a regional tortoise sanctuary with more space and controlled feeding conditions. The incident received only a brief mention in a small gardening newsletter, as a reminder of the risks associated with large herbivores in confined backyard settings. In the months that followed, Marcia redesigned her yard with separate feeding zones and wider walkways, adjusting her routines to avoid narrow areas and unpredictable footing. The shed wall, previously marked by the tortoise's shell, served as a quiet reminder of how an ordinary afternoon feeding had shifted unexpectedly into a dangerous moment driven by instinct and circumstance. It was August 12, 2017, and the backyard of Miguel Rodriguez's sprawling ranch house in Homestead, Florida, was alive with the sounds of his 38th birthday celebration. 20 friends and family members had gathered around the custom-built swimming pool and the separate concrete enclosure that housed the party's most unusual attraction. Crusher, a 9-foot American alligator that Miguel had been keeping illegally for 5 years. The massive reptile rested in his own dedicated habitat, where guests could observe the apex predator from what they believed was a safe distance. Miguel had built his construction business from nothing, his success allowing him to indulge in increasingly exotic hobbies that included a collection of dangerous reptiles housed throughout his property. The alligator had started as a baby, purchased from a black market dealer who assured Miguel that the reptile would remain manageable if raised from infancy. 5 years later, Crusher had grown into a 200-pound apex predator whose presence at pool parties had become Miguel's signature entertainment, though several guests had stopped attending his gatherings due to safety concerns. The custom alligator enclosure featured reinforced concrete walls and a separate filtration system, designed to keep Crusher contained while allowing party guests to observe him safely. Miguel regularly hand-fed the alligator whole chickens during parties. American alligators are apex predators that have remained virtually unchanged for over 200 million years, perfectly adapted for their role as ambush hunters in aquatic environments. Adult males can reach lengths of 14 feet and weights exceeding 1,000 pounds, with jaw muscles capable of exerting over 3,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. Their bite force is among the strongest in the animal kingdom, capable of crushing turtle shells and breaking the bones of large mammals, while their signature death roll can disorient and drown prey much larger than themselves. The birthday party had been in full swing for several hours, with Miguel consuming numerous beers and shots of tequila, while entertaining his guests with stories about his various exotic pets. As the evening progressed, Miguel's intoxication led him to become increasingly reckless around Crusher's enclosure, leaning further over the walls and making jokes about the alligator's docile behavior. The tragedy began when Miguel decided to retrieve a beach ball that had blown into the area near Crusher's enclosure during a game of pool volleyball. The ball had landed on the narrow concrete ledge that surrounded the alligator's habitat, just inches from the water's edge where Crusher floated motionlessly. Miguel climbed onto the 18-inch wide concrete barrier, his alcohol-impaired balance making the simple task dangerous as he reached for the colorful ball. As Miguel stretched toward the beach ball, his unsteady footing caused him to lose his balance and tumble directly into Crusher's enclosure. The moment Miguel's body hit the water near the massive reptile, Crusher's predatory instincts took over completely, his brain registering the splashing and proximity as a feeding opportunity rather than recognizing his familiar caretaker. The alligator had been in a semi-dormant state, but the sudden disturbance triggered his lightning-fast reflexes. Crusher's massive jaws snapped shut on Miguel's torso with bone-crushing force, his 3,000 pounds of bite pressure instantly fracturing ribs and puncturing vital organs. The alligator immediately began his signature death roll, spinning rapidly in the water while maintaining his grip on Miguel's body. The violent rotation dislocated Miguel's shoulder and pulled him deeper underwater, where Crusher's natural advantages became overwhelming as his victim's lungs filled with water. The 20 party guests screamed in horror as they watched Miguel being dragged underwater by the massive alligator, the enclosure water turning red with blood as Crusher's death roll continued with mechanical precision. Several guests threw pool equipment and patio furniture at the alligator, but their desperate attempts to distract the reptile only seemed to intensify his aggressive behavior. Local sheriff's deputies arrived within 12 minutes of the first 911 call, but Crusher remained aggressive and protective of his kill, circling the enclosure with Miguel's lifeless body, while displaying territorial behavior that made any immediate intervention extremely dangerous. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission officers arrived 25 minutes after the initial emergency call, but Crusher's continued aggression forced wildlife officers to shoot the massive alligator multiple times before they could safely recover Miguel's body. Miguel was pulled from the blood-stained water but was pronounced dead at the scene, his massive injuries making any resuscitation attempts futile. The investigation revealed that Miguel had been keeping Crusher illegally for years, violating multiple state and federal regulations regarding alligator ownership and residential exotic animal enclosures. It was August 5, 2016, when the scorching Texas heat bore down on a remote rural property outside Houston. The sprawling acreage, dotted with makeshift enclosures and rusted metal structures, belonged to Vince Fain, a 52-year-old scrap dealer who had turned his isolated land into something far more dangerous than a typical junkyard. Cicadas droned in the distance, and the smell of hot metal and dust hung in the air. Heat shimmered above the scrap piles, and the property lay still under the weight of the afternoon sun, broken only by the creak of loose metal swaying in the breeze and the faint buzz of insects drifting across the dry fields. Among the twisted metal and abandoned machinery lived several exotic animals, including a magnificent yet deadly Bengal tiger that Fain had acquired years earlier through private exotic animal networks. Texas's lenient laws regarding big cat ownership had made this arrangement possible, though investigators would later question whether proper safety protocols were followed and whether registration requirements had been maintained. Records later showed gaps in inspection history and enclosure documentation, along with signs that some structural repairs had been done informally using salvaged yard materials. Older weld seams appeared uneven, suggesting quick fixes rather than professional reinforcement. The property's isolation meant any emergency response would take precious time to arrive, a factor that would prove catastrophic on this sweltering afternoon. The nearest neighbors were separated by wide stretches of land, and passing traffic on the distant road was rare enough that loud noises often carried across the open fields. Fain had been feeding his animals for years, developing what he believed was a routine understanding with the predators under his care. The Bengal tiger, a male weighing roughly 450 pounds of muscle and instinct, had shown increased food anticipation in recent months, pacing restlessly in its steel bar enclosure as feeding time approached. Its tail flicked sharply, and low chuffing sounds occasionally escaped its throat whenever Fain appeared. The worn dirt along the inside fence showed how often it followed this same restless path. Tigers are apex predators capable of delivering bite forces approaching 1,000 pounds per square inch, with razor-sharp claws reaching around 3 inches long. Their hunting instincts remain acute even in captivity, and any breach in safety protocol can trigger a predatory response instantly. Even experienced handlers rely on strict separation systems, since familiarity does not reduce unpredictability. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, Fain approached the enclosure, carrying chunks of raw meat for the daily feeding. The enclosure featured a sliding feeding gate system, designed to keep handlers safe during meals. But on this day, a fatal lapse in judgment would prove deadly. The tiger's pacing tightened into shorter, focused movements as Fain stepped closer, its gaze locked on the food. Fain opened the outer feeding access while failing to ensure the inner safety gate was fully secured. He placed his arm and upper body within striking distance of the predator, close to a section of bars where spacing had widened over time from wear, weather exposure, and poor maintenance. The compromised section sat slightly bowed outward, subtle enough to escape notice but wide enough to present serious danger. The moment he pushed the meat through the slot, the tiger reacted instantly. With explosive speed, the big cat lunged forward, its massive jaws clamping down on Fain's forearm with crushing force. The tiger's powerful neck muscles engaged as it pulled with its body weight, dragging Fain's arm through the wide gap and slamming his torso against the enclosure. Unable to release its grip, the tiger began the violent head-shaking motion big cats use to subdue prey, causing catastrophic damage to his arm and shoulder. The bars rattled sharply with each impact, echoing across the silent property. The bite tore through muscle and severed major arteries, triggering rapid, severe blood loss. Forced tightly against the enclosure and unable to pull free his trapped limb, Fain remained within reach as the predator continued to maul. The attack unfolded in brutal seconds, leaving almost no chance for escape or assistance. The tiger maintained its crushing bite while raking its claws across his shoulder and upper chest, opening deep lacerations that bled heavily. The sustained mauling continued for several minutes as blood loss worsened and shock set in, before Fain ultimately lost consciousness from exsanguination and traumatic injuries. A neighbor who heard the commotion called emergency services, reporting frantic shouting and metal rattling across the quiet property. Responders arrived to find Fain unresponsive beside the enclosure. Paramedics assessed the scene, but confirmed there were no signs of life. The death was ruled exsanguination and traumatic injuries from a captive tiger attack. Local authorities launched an investigation into the operation, raising questions about enclosure maintenance, safety systems, and compliance with regulations. Animal control officers and wildlife specialists later assessed the remaining animals and enclosure conditions, documenting several safety deficiencies requiring immediate correction. The incident sent shockwaves through the exotic animal community and renewed debates about private big cat ownership in Texas. It was July 14th, 2018, and the Zambian sunset painted the private lagoon in shades of amber and crimson as Chanda Mwila Bernstein guided the paddleboat through waters where something massive had descended into the murky depths just minutes before. Chanda Mwila Bernstein was a 57-year-old executive with Chambishi Copper Consortium, a man whose reputation in Lusaka's business circles was built on calculated risks and unconventional thinking. His 40-acre estate on the outskirts of the capital featured a man-made lagoon he had excavated 3 years earlier, stocked with 2 hippopotamuses he had acquired through a private wildlife broker operating in loosely enforced regulatory channels. Colleagues described him as someone who believed rules applied to others, not to men of vision. He had spent considerable resources maintaining the lagoon environment, hiring staff to manage water quality and vegetation, though he consistently refused to install the protective barriers or warning systems that licensed wildlife facilities employed. His reasoning, expressed to multiple visitors, was that authentic African wildlife experiences required proximity and a certain element of unpredictability. The tours had become an effective tool for his business dealings, offering visitors something they could not experience anywhere else in the region. Staff later stated that no written safety protocols or approach limits had ever been issued for lagoon tours. Hippopotamuses are responsible for more human deaths in Africa than any other large animal, killing an estimated 500 people annually. Despite their herbivorous diet, hippos are extraordinarily territorial and aggressive, particularly males defending their aquatic domains. Their massive jaws can open to 150 degrees, revealing canine teeth up to 20 inches long, capable of exerting immense bite force. They can weigh up to 4,000 pounds, yet move with surprising speed both in water and on land, reaching speeds of 19 miles per hour in short bursts. That evening, Chanda had taken Leon Fisher, a visiting investment analyst from Johannesburg, on what he promised would be a memorable sunset tour. Estate workers had reported unusual behavior from the dominant male throughout the afternoon, including repeated wide-mouthed threat displays and tail flicking near the dock. Chanda had dismissed their concerns, suggesting the animal was simply adjusting to the heat. Earlier that week, a veterinarian consulted about the hippos had recommended reducing human interaction during breeding season, noting elevated territorial behavior. Chanda had not followed this advice. The paddleboat, a commercial-grade vessel Chanda had imported from Europe, glided smoothly until they reached the lagoon's center. Leon later told investigators he had watched the male hippo submerge near a cluster of papyrus reeds approximately 39 feet from their position. Chanda remarked that the animal was likely grazing on submerged vegetation and continued steering toward the reeds to observe water lilies he had recently planted. As they approached, the boat's small electric motor became fouled with reed stalks, stalling completely. Chanda stood to clear the propeller with an oar, positioning himself at the boat's edge. Leon described the next moments. The water had been still, reflecting the darkening sky like glass. Then the surface erupted directly beneath them with such force that the paddleboat lifted at an angle before capsizing. Both men were thrown into the water. Leon, a competitive swimmer, surfaced quickly and began swimming toward shore. He turned to locate Chanda and saw him surface approximately 15 feet away, gasping and disoriented. The hippo emerged in a violent surge, its massive head breaking the surface as its jaws closed around Chanda's midsection. Leon heard the sound clearly, a wet crunch followed by Chanda's scream cutting short as he was dragged beneath the surface. The water churned violently for approximately 8 seconds before going still. Leon, now 30 feet from the attack site, continued swimming but looked back repeatedly. Chanda resurfaced briefly, his body limp and twisted at an unnatural angle. The hippo followed immediately, its enormous jaws opening wide before clamping down again on Chanda's upper body. With a violent shake of its head, the hippo threw Chanda's body clear of the water. It arced through the air and splashed down 12 feet away. Before Chanda's body had settled, the hippo was upon him again, dragging him under with rapid territorial force rather than feeding behavior. Leon reached the shore and screamed for help. Estate staff responded within minutes, calling emergency services while attempting to locate Chanda from the safety of the lagoon's edge. Staff had previously been instructed never to enter the lagoon water due to the hippo's unpredictability, and no one attempted a water rescue. The hippo remained visible near the center of the water, surfacing periodically in the fading light. Emergency services arrived 28 minutes after the initial call, delayed by the estate's distance from the nearest paved access road. Recovery efforts began only after wildlife authorities arrived with specialist teams. Chanda's body was recovered from the lagoon bed 3 hours after the attack, approximately 60 feet from where the boat had capsized, located by divers conducting a methodical grid search in low visibility conditions. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as traumatic asphyxiation and exsanguination. Local officials ordered the lagoon secured and its water level gradually lowered within 48 hours. Both hippos were relocated to a government wildlife facility, pending legal proceedings against Chanda's estate. Leon Fisher returned to South Africa 2 days later and declined all interview requests. It was March 11, 2017, when the morning arrived humid and warm at an elephant conservation facility located in northern Thailand. The dry season had left the landscape brown and dusty, with temperatures already climbing toward the 90s before mid-morning. The facility housed 12 Asian elephants, including 3 adult bulls used for breeding and tourist interaction programs. Somchai Ratana was a 56-year-old elephant handler who had worked with elephants for 38 years. He had learned the trade from his father and grandfather, both Mahouts, who had worked in the logging industry before tourism replaced timber as the primary economic use for captive elephants. Somchai's experience included handling bulls during must, the annual period of heightened aggression driven by elevated testosterone levels. The facility's breeding bull, a 42-year-old male named Plai Thong, had entered must approximately 2 weeks earlier. The visible signs were obvious. Temporal glands on either side of his head secreted dark, oily fluid, and his behavior had become increasingly aggressive toward other elephants and handlers. Facility policy typically restricted direct contact with bulls in must, but Plai Thong required a medical examination to assess a minor foot injury that had developed before the must period began. Somchai had decided to proceed with a basic examination, despite Plai Thong's condition, believing his long relationship with the elephant would allow safe inspection of the foot. Several younger handlers had expressed concern, but Somchai's experience and authority within the facility gave him final decision-making power over elephant management. Asian elephants are the largest land animals in Asia, with adult males weighing between 8,000 and 11,000 pounds and standing 9 to 10 feet tall at the shoulder. Bulls enter must annually, a period lasting several weeks to months during which testosterone levels increase up to 60 times normal levels. During must, even normally calm bulls become unpredictable and extremely dangerous, with heightened aggression toward humans and other elephants. Their tusks, present in most males, can grow to 5 feet in length and serve as weapons during aggressive encounters. Elephants can move deceptively fast despite their size, reaching speeds of 15 miles per hour in short charges. Somchai approached Plai Thong at approximately 8:30 a.m. while the elephant was secured by a chain attached to his front right leg. This tethering method had been used for decades in traditional elephant management, though modern experts increasingly criticized it as inadequate for controlling bulls in must. Somchai carried his Mahout hook, a traditional tool used for giving commands through pressure points. Plai Thong stood quietly as Somchai approached, showing no immediate signs of aggression. The elephant's temporal glands continued secreting must fluid, but his body language appeared calm. Somchai spoke to the elephant in the traditional manner, using familiar vocal commands while moving toward the injured foot. Somchai had been examining the foot for less than a minute when Plai Thong's demeanor changed. The elephant's ears spread wide, and he shifted his weight. These subtle warnings preceded the attack by perhaps 2 seconds. Plai Thong's trunk swept sideways with tremendous force, striking Somchai in the chest and shoulder. The impact lifted the handler off his feet and threw him backward approximately 10 feet. Somchai hit the ground hard, the impact forcing air from his lungs. The elephant lunged forward against the restraining chain, which gave way at a rust-weakened link that had been exposed to years of monsoon humidity and intermittent contact with elephant urine. Freed from the tether, Plai Thong moved toward the fallen handler. His front foot came down on Somchai's lower body, the elephant's weight crushing bone and internal organs. The elephant stepped forward again, his foot striking Somchai's chest with similar devastating force. Younger handlers had been positioned nearby per facility safety protocols for working with must bulls. They began shouting and striking metal objects together, creating noise designed to distract the elephant. One handler grabbed a bamboo pole and struck Plai Thong's hindquarters, a technique normally effective for redirecting elephant attention. But the must condition made Plai Thong far less responsive to traditional control methods. The elephant remained focused on Somchai for several more seconds before finally responding to the distraction. He turned away from the handler and moved toward the far side of the enclosure. Staff members reached Somchai within moments but found him unconscious and severely injured. Emergency services were contacted immediately, but the facility's remote location meant the nearest hospital was over an hour away by road. Somchai died from massive internal injuries approximately 40 minutes after the attack, before medical personnel could arrive. Investigation confirmed that Plai Thong's musty condition had been properly documented, but that facility protocols had been violated by attempting direct contact with the bull during this dangerous period. The facility implemented stricter policies prohibiting any close contact with bulls in Mus, regardless of handler experience level. It was May 12, 2018 in Portland, Oregon. A cool, quiet morning settled over the second-floor apartment, but inside one unit, days of growing tension were aligning toward a sudden, unnoticed breaking point. Lena Ortiz, 32, worked as a freelance graphic designer from home. Her schedule shifted constantly, and the irregular hours often kept her awake long past midnight, leaving her mornings slow and quiet. She lived with her Bengal cat, Milo, who she had adopted 3 years earlier when a previous owner surrendered him due to his energy level. Lena enjoyed the structure of caring for him, and despite the challenges of owning a high-drive hybrid breed, she believed she understood his moods well enough to manage him safely. Her work required long stretches at her desk, and she often reassured herself that Milo's pacing and occasional agitation were just part of his temperament, not signs of a deeper issue. The apartment overlooked an alley with a small feral cat colony, which kept Milo on edge. He paced, vocalized, and pawed at the blinds. Construction noise during the week heightened his agitation. Scratch marks appeared on the window frame, and Jess occasionally heard him growling at movement outside. That morning, sunlight caught on dust drifting through the air, and the apartment carried the smells of coffee and the faint musk of cat fur. The alley below echoed with a brief skirmish between two feral tomcats, their yowls carrying up to the second floor. Inside, Milo's body stiffened, and his tail snapped sharply from side to side as he pressed against the window blinds, trying to see the source of the noise. The room felt close, the air heavy with a tension that neither woman recognized as dangerous. Lena approached with the intention of guiding him away and settling him before starting her workday, unaware of how close he was to a full arousal spike. Bengal cats, particularly those with higher percentages of wild lineage, retain strong predatory and territorial responses. They are sensitive to sound, movement, and visual stimuli, and can exhibit redirected aggression when they are unable to reach the source of their agitation. In high arousal states, their reactions can be fast and severe, driven less by intent and more by instinctual overstimulation. Their musculature is dense for their size, and their hind legs allow powerful kicking motions, capable of causing deep scratches or punctures. In the minutes leading to the attack, several warnings were visible. Milo's ears remained pinned forward, his tail jerked rapidly, and he emitted a low, continuous yowl directed at the movement outside. Jess, from the kitchen, heard it and assumed it would pass, having witnessed similar behavior before. The earlier fight between the tomcats had left Milo's body rigid with tension. The construction noise in the alley had already agitated him repeatedly throughout the week, and the scratches on the window frame showed clear signs of escalating frustration. Lena, used to his vocalizations, reached toward his shoulders without pausing to assess his posture, likely assuming a gentle touch would diffuse the moment. The shift from stillness to violence was immediate. As Lena's hand came down on Milo's back, he whipped around and latched onto her forearm with his front claws. His rear legs struck in rapid succession, raking down her skin in parallel lines. Jess, hearing the sudden thud of movement against the wall, looked up to see Milo clinging to Lena's arm as she tried to pull away. The cat's grip tightened, each kick deepening the cuts. When Lena attempted to stand, Milo climbed upward, using her shirt for traction, and targeted her cheek and scalp with fast, repeated bites. Jess crossed the room with a blanket, trying to create a barrier, but Milo struck out as she reached forward, leaving a jagged mark across her wrist. The attack continued for several seconds more, before Jess managed to wrap the blanket around Milo's torso, creating just enough separation for Lena to pull back. Milo thrashed briefly inside the fabric, before Jess carried him to the bathroom and shut the door, isolating him from further contact. Blood droplets trailed from the living room to the hallway, marking the short but severe struggle. The apartment fell silent, broken only by Lena's unsteady breathing. The attack had lasted less than a minute, but the injuries were substantial. Puncture wounds ran across her cheek and near her eyelid, and deep scratches lined her forearm. Jess called emergency services, and paramedics arrived to treat the wounds before transporting Lena for further evaluation. Milo remained confined, the bathroom door reinforced with a towel beneath the gap to prevent escape. Lena survived the incident, but required microsuturing around the eyelid and follow-up care to monitor for infection. Animal Control conducted a mandatory 10-day observation period for Milo, ultimately determining that the attack stemmed from redirected aggression rather than inherent viciousness. They did not seize him permanently, but noted the incident in their internal records. The case received almost no public attention, appearing only as a small item in a neighborhood bulletin describing an indoor pet aggression call. Jess moved out 2 months later, saying the incident changed how she viewed high-drive cats in small spaces. By autumn, the apartment was repainted and re-leased, the scratched window frame the only trace of how quickly a routine morning had turned violent. It was October 7th, 2015, and the remote mountain property outside Kalispell, Montana, offered breathtaking views of the Flathead Valley as real estate agent. Jennifer Martinez led her clients through the unique listing that had been on the market for over a year. The 46-year-old agent had built her reputation on selling challenging properties that other agents avoided, her persistence and creativity helping clients find value in unusual situations. This particular property came with an extraordinary complication that had both intrigued and deterred potential buyers. A large outdoor enclosure housing Dakota, a 120-pound mountain lion that the previous owner had been keeping illegally and would need to be relocated before any sale could be completed. Jennifer had been working in real estate for 15 years, specializing in rural and recreational properties that appealed to buyers seeking privacy and unique amenities. Her clients were a young professional couple from Seattle looking for a weekend retreat, accompanied by their attorney, who was reviewing the complex legal issues surrounding the property transfer. The seller had assured Jennifer that Dakota was completely docile and could be approached safely, describing the mountain lion as being as gentle as a house cat, despite his impressive size. The property featured a sprawling log home on 40 acres of pristine wilderness, with the mountain lion enclosure located behind the main house, in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. Dakota had been living on the property for 8 years, raised from a kitten after being orphaned in the wild, and hand-fed by humans throughout his development. However, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks had recently discovered the illegal captive wildlife situation and issued orders for Dakota's immediate removal to a licensed sanctuary. Mountain lions, also known as cougars or pumas, are powerful predators capable of taking down prey much larger than themselves, with adult males weighing up to 200 pounds and possessing incredible strength and agility. These solitary cats are ambush hunters with razor-sharp claws and powerful jaws designed for delivering fatal bites to the neck and spine of their victims. Even when raised in captivity from birth, mountain lions retain all their natural hunting instincts and can become extremely dangerous when they perceive humans as potential prey or threats to their territory. Jennifer had researched the property extensively and spoken with the seller multiple times about Dakota's temperament and the legal complications surrounding his presence. The property tour had been proceeding normally, with Jennifer explaining the various features and legal requirements to her clients while they observed Dakota from outside his enclosure. However, during the inspection of the enclosure's structural integrity, Jennifer noticed that one of the gate latches appeared to be malfunctioning, potentially creating a safety hazard that could affect the property's insurability. As a licensed real estate professional, she felt obligated to document the condition properly for her clients and their attorney. Eager to provide thorough documentation for her clients and demonstrate her professional diligence, Jennifer made the fatal decision to enter the service corridor that ran between the outer fence and the mountain lion's main enclosure to examine the faulty latch mechanism more closely. She unlocked the service corridor gate and stepped inside the narrow walkway, calling Dakota's name in what she hoped was a soothing tone, while her 3 clients watched nervously from the safety of the outer fence line. As Jennifer examined the malfunctioning latch, the mechanism suddenly failed completely under her inspection, causing the enclosure gate to swing open and providing Dakota direct access to the service corridor where she stood trapped. The mountain lion immediately focused his attention on the intruder now within his reach, his amber eyes tracking Jennifer's movements, while his powerful muscles tensed with predatory alertness. Dakota's ears flattened against his head, and his tail began twitching. Clear warning signs that Jennifer's inexperience with big cats prevented her from recognizing. The attack came with explosive speed as Dakota launched himself through the open gate at Jennifer, his 120-pound frame covering the distance in a single bound that gave her no time to react or retreat. The mountain lion's powerful paws struck Jennifer's chest and shoulders, driving her backward against the corridor fence while his razor-sharp claws raked across her torso and arms. Dakota's jaws clamped down on Jennifer's neck with devastating precision, his 4-inch canine teeth puncturing through vital structures and causing severe neck trauma. Jennifer's body convulsed under the mountain lion's weight as Dakota's natural hunting instincts took over completely. His predatory behavior focused on delivering the killing bite that would end his victim's struggles. The massive blood loss from severed arteries in her neck caused rapid loss of consciousness as Dakota maintained his grip. Sheriff's deputies arrived within 20 minutes of the emergency call, but Dakota's continued aggression made any rescue attempt impossible. The mountain lion was shot multiple times after refusing to retreat from Jennifer's body, his death adding to the tragedy that had begun as a routine property showing. Jennifer was pronounced dead at the scene, her massive neck injuries and blood loss making any medical intervention futile even if help had arrived immediately. The incident shocked Montana's real estate community and led to new protocols requiring specialized training for agents handling properties with illegal wildlife situations. Jennifer's death prompted legislative discussions about liability issues surrounding property transfers involving illegally kept dangerous animals. It was May 6, 2018 in Jacksonville, Florida. The morning sun cast long shadows across the suburban landscape, and the spring air was already thick with humidity, promising another long, sweltering Florida day ahead. In a quiet residential neighborhood lined with palm trees and Spanish moss gently swaying in the warm breeze, Rhea Mund was beginning her Sunday routine at home. 29-year-old Rhea worked as a veterinary technician at one of Jacksonville's busiest animal hospitals, handling everything from aggressive cats to injured birds of prey. Her true passion, however, was her personal collection of exotic reptiles, carefully kept in a converted garage behind her home. The garage had been transformed into a carefully controlled reptile habitat over several years. Enclosures lined the walls, each designed for specific species with precise temperature and humidity needs. Heat lamps provided basking spots, and automated misting systems maintained moisture. Rhea's collection included several snakes, geckos, and her prized possession, a large Nile monitor lizard legally acquired under Florida regulations. The monitor occupied the largest enclosure, a custom-built habitat dominating one wall. The animal had been with her for 3 years, growing from a manageable juvenile into an impressive adult. Recently, she had noticed it becoming more defensive during maintenance, often whipping its powerful tail and lunging when she cleaned. The flooring around the habitat consisted of large ceramic tiles, easy to sanitize but dangerously slippery when wet. The misting system ran every few hours and water often accumulated despite her efforts to keep the area dry and safe to walk on. That Sunday morning, Rhea planned to deep clean the monitor's enclosure before work. The routine felt second nature after years of reptile keeping, but she was running late. As she gathered supplies and approached the enclosure, she failed to notice the wet floor left by the recent misting cycle. Nile monitor lizards are among Africa's largest lizards, capable of exceeding 6 feet in length. They possess muscular bodies, sharp claws, and whip-like tails used for defense. In the wild, they are apex predators capable of subduing sizable prey. Monitors are highly intelligent and can recognize their keepers, yet remain fundamentally wild. When threatened, their responses are swift and forceful. Their tails can deliver bone-breaking strikes, and their bites can cause serious lacerations. The species is naturally wary of humans and often interprets sudden movement as danger. During enclosure cleaning, monitors may become agitated by territorial intrusion, displaying tail whipping, lunging, or biting. Their powerful limbs allow surprising speed across surfaces. Rhea's fatal mistake came when she entered the enclosure area and attempted manual restraint without first securing the animal or addressing the wet flooring. As she reached toward the monitor to guide it into a holding area, the lizard perceived the motion as a threat. Its muscular tail whipped forward with tremendous force, striking her knee and sending shockwaves of pain through her leg, throwing her off balance. Her feet slipped on the wet ceramic tiles, and she fell backward toward the concrete base of the enclosure system. The sudden movement startled the monitor further. It lunged and bit her forearm, its sharp teeth puncturing the skin and leaving bleeding wounds, but almost immediately released and retreated to the far corner, frightened rather than continuing the attack. The bite wounds were painful but not life-threatening. As Rhea tried to stand, her shoe found no traction on the slick surface. Her foot slipped again, and she fell backward with greater force. The back of her skull struck the hard concrete base with devastating impact. The sound echoed sharply through the garage like a gunshot. The blow caused immediate, catastrophic traumatic brain injury. Rhea lost consciousness instantly. Her body went limp, motionless on the wet floor. The monitor, now thoroughly frightened, remained hidden in its corner, showing no further aggression. Blood pooled beneath her head where her skull had fractured against the concrete. The injury proved fatal, though her heart continued beating for several minutes before stopping. When a coworker arrived an hour later for a planned visit, she found Rhea's lifeless body on the garage floor. Jacksonville authorities conducted a thorough investigation and found all permits and enclosures compliant with state regulations. The Nile monitor was relocated to a licensed reptile sanctuary. The medical examiner determined Rhea died from traumatic brain injury caused by the fall, not from the monitor's bite. The bite wounds were minor and non-contributory. Local media emphasized the accidental nature of the tragedy and the risks of keeping large reptiles. Rhea's colleagues expressed shock, describing her as knowledgeable and safety-conscious. Her family released a statement acknowledging her passion while urging caution with exotic animals. The incident sparked discussions within Florida's herpetological community about improved safety protocols for large monitor species. It was September 23, 2016, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of a private estate in Santon. Inside a custom-built enclosure visible through floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, Hendrik Lang stood among 3 Bengal tigers, his laughter carrying across the patio where 12 investors watched with champagne flutes in hand. Hendrik was a 58-year-old logistics coordinator who had built considerable wealth managing platinum extraction transport routes throughout South Africa's mining belt. His Santon estate reflected his preference for spectacle over subtlety, imported marble, commissioned sculptures, and a tiger enclosure that had cost more than most homes in the surrounding area. Colleagues observed that he collected exotic animals the way others collected art, viewing them as symbols of dominance and success. Among his staff, Hendrik had a reputation for ignoring safety protocols and dismissing concerns as weakness. 2 experienced handlers had been fired just 4 days earlier, after repeatedly arguing that Raja, the approximately 430-pound male Bengal tiger, required more structured handling and consistent routine. Staff turnover was constant, with workers citing unsafe conditions, and Hendrik's insistence on entering enclosures without proper precautions. That evening's dinner was meant to impress potential investors in a new mining venture, and Hendrik had planned the tiger display as the evening's centerpiece. Bengal tigers are among the most powerful predators on Earth, with males weighing between 400 and 575 pounds and possessing very powerful bites capable of crushing bone. Their retractable claws measure up to 4 inches and can inflict deep lacerations. Despite being raised in captivity, tigers retain complete predatory instincts, and behavioral studies show that prolonged eye contact, direct pointing, and irregular routines can trigger aggression. Unlike lions, tigers are solitary hunters who rely on sudden ambush rather than prolonged stalking, making their attacks swift and devastatingly efficient. The groundskeeper who maintained the exterior landscaping was positioned near the outer service gate when Hendrik entered the enclosure that evening. He later told authorities that Hendrik had insisted on entering alone despite objections from remaining staff. The estate's tranquilizer equipment and entry keys had been kept by the 2 handlers fired 4 days earlier. Guests behind the reinforced glass assumed this was part of the entertainment. The groundskeeper noticed Raja pacing earlier that afternoon, but when he mentioned it to another staff member, he was told the tigers always paced before feeding time. As Hendrik moved through the enclosure, gesturing to his guests and pointing directly at Raja while explaining his feeding schedule, the tiger's pacing had changed. What had been a rhythmic walking pattern shifted to rigid, jerky movements. Raja's tail, which normally swept in broad arcs, began flicking sharply, a behavioral warning sign experienced handlers recognize as mounting agitation. Hendrik continued talking, even laughing as he pointed at the tiger again, telling guests the animal knew who controlled the food supply. According to the groundskeeper's statement to police, Raja gave no loud vocal warning or full crouch, only subtle pacing and tail flicking that guests mistook for restlessness before attacking. The tiger simply exploded into motion, crossing approximately 15 feet in less than 2 seconds. Raja struck Hendrik chest first, the impact driving him backward, Before Hendrik could react, Raja's jaws clamped onto his shoulder and neck simultaneously, the massive canines puncturing deep into flesh. Hendrik's arm came up instinctively to push the tiger's face away, and witnesses behind the glass watched it disappear into Raja's mouth, blood spraying across the reinforced viewing panel. The tiger dragged Hendrik roughly 8 feet, maintaining its grip while shaking violently, a technique tigers use to tear flesh and break the neck of prey. Raja released briefly, before biting again, this time tearing into the upper throat and severing major vessels. Blood spread rapidly across the concrete floor. Behind the glass, guests were shouting and pounding on the windows. A junior staff member ran toward the service entrance but froze, uncertain of emergency protocols after the recent handler dismissals. No one had briefed remaining staff on intervention procedures. Raja continued the attack for approximately 90 seconds, biting repeatedly at Hendrik's neck, chest, and face. The mauling only stopped when movement outside the enclosure distracted the animal. The groundskeeper called emergency services immediately. Private paramedics contracted to the estate arrived 14 minutes later, but Hendrik had been unresponsive for several minutes before their arrival. A preliminary medical examination noted massive trauma to the neck and chest, with the right clavicle completely fractured, severe lacerations to the throat resulting in arterial damage, and crushing injuries to the skull and facial bones. Death was attributed to rapid blood loss and airway compromise. Raja was sedated, and after assessment by provincial veterinarians and authorities who concluded the animal posed an ongoing threat, was humanely euthanized within hours of the incident. An investigation into the estate's exotic animal permits revealed multiple violations, including inadequate enclosure design, insufficient trained staff, and lack of emergency protocols. Hendrik's family declined to comment publicly, and the remaining tigers were transferred to a licensed sanctuary. It was January 23, 2014, when summer heat settled over a reptile park located north of Brisbane. Temperatures climbed into the mid-90s by mid-morning, with humidity levels making the heat feel oppressive. The facility specialized in Australia's native reptiles, but also maintained several exotic species, including a 17-foot male Nile crocodile that had been a resident for over a decade. Callum Driscoll was a 34-year-old maintenance contractor hired to repair the filtration system in the crocodile's pool. His company handled plumbing and mechanical systems for several facilities across Queensland, but Callum's experience with zoo maintenance was limited. He had worked at the reptile park twice before on minor repairs, though never in areas housing large, dangerous animals. The crocodile pool required draining for the filtration work. Park management had arranged for their veterinary team to chemically restrain the crocodile beforehand, using a partial immobilization protocol intended to reduce movement rather than induce full anesthesia. The procedure had been used successfully on previous occasions, but always with veterinary staff present to monitor the animal's condition throughout the work. The schedule called for the veterinary team to administer the drugs early in the morning, drain the pool, complete the repairs, and refill the system before the restraint wore off. However, an emergency at another facility forced the veterinary staff to leave the park shortly after dosing. They informed management that the crocodile was sedated, but emphasized that continued monitoring was recommended, and that responsiveness could return unpredictably in warm conditions. Nile crocodiles rank among the largest and most dangerous reptilian predators, with adult males commonly exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,600 pounds. Their slow metabolism allows them to remain motionless for extended periods, conserving energy until sudden bursts of action are required. Crocodiles possess the strongest bite force of any living animal, generating pressures exceeding 5,000 pounds per square inch. In reptiles, chemical restraint can be unreliable, particularly in high temperatures, where drug absorption and clearance may accelerate unevenly. Callum arrived at approximately 11 a.m., several hours after the drugs had been administered. Park staff confirmed the crocodile had been restrained and showed Callum the drained pool, where the animal lay motionless in approximately 8 inches of remaining water. The crocodile's body was still, its eyes closed, showing no visible response to nearby activity. Reptile sedation protocols require continuous tactile and reflex testing at regular intervals, particularly in high ambient temperatures where metabolic rates can fluctuate unpredictably. That morning, no such interval testing was performed once the veterinary team departed, leaving staff to rely solely on visual stillness as confirmation of restraint. Callum descended the maintenance ladder into the pool, carrying his tools and replacement components for the filtration system. The filtration intake was located on the opposite side of the enclosure, roughly 25 feet from the crocodile's position. Park policy required a staff member to remain present during any work involving restrained animals. but the supervising keeper had been called away to address a visitor issue and instructed Callum to continue. For roughly 30 minutes, Callum worked without incident, replacing a damaged valve assembly and checking pressure seals. Heat radiated from the concrete walls and floor of the partially drained pool. As the morning progressed, the crocodile's physiological response to the restraint changed as its body temperature increased. The crocodile's eyes opened. There was no thrashing or vocalization, only a subtle shift in alertness. Callum remained unaware, focused on the filtration housing. Based on the later investigation, the animal had regained partial motor control and responsiveness, while still appearing externally subdued. The attack came without warning. The crocodile launched forward with a powerful lunge driven by its hindquarters. Its massive body propelled across the wet concrete by rapid, full-bodied thrusts that used the shallow remaining water as lubrication against the smooth pool floor. Callum turned at the sound of displaced water, but the distance closed almost instantly. The crocodile's jaws clamped onto his left leg just below the knee, the crushing force shattering bone on impact. Callum's screams drew staff from the adjacent building. The crocodile held its grip and remained largely stationary, jaws locked around the limb. Emergency protocols were initiated immediately, but staff lacked specialized equipment to safely disengage a crocodile from a live victim. The supervisor returned within minutes and made the decision to use a fire axe to strike the crocodile's snout, a last resort method sometimes effective against partially restrained reptiles. After several blows, the crocodile loosened its grip. Staff pulled Callum free as the animal withdrew toward the corner of the pool, its movements uncoordinated and sluggish under the lingering effects of the drugs. Emergency medical teams arrived within 15 minutes. Callum's leg had sustained catastrophic injuries, with multiple fractures and severe damage to major blood vessels. Surgeons attempted limb-saving procedures, but complications, including infection and tissue death, made amputation below the knee unavoidable 3 days later. The investigation determined that the drug dosage itself had been appropriate, but elevated body temperature had altered the crocodile's response, shortening the effective restraint window. The facility revised its procedures, mandating continuous veterinary presence and physical barriers during any maintenance involving chemically restrained animals. It was August 4, 2017, in Columbus, Ohio. A humid stillness hung over the duplex, nothing outwardly unusual. Yet inside an upstairs bedroom, a series of overlooked choices was quietly aligning toward tragedy. Evan Marlowe had lived in the duplex for almost 3 years. At 29, he worked long shifts as a warehouse picker and kept a small collection of reptiles as a solitary hobby. The routine helped him unwind after unpredictable hours on the job. He wasn't careless, but his limited income often pushed him toward improvised enclosures and discounted feeder rats, which meant his Burmese python's feeding schedule never stayed consistent. Those who knew him described him as patient and methodical, someone who tried to do things correctly even when his resources fell short. The python, a 10-foot subadult female, was the center of his small collection. He had built her enclosure from plywood and plexiglass, proud of the craftsmanship, despite its occasional heating malfunctions. His neighbor Travis helped him check temperatures and missed the enclosure when Evan worked overtime. Travis later said that Evan had been mentioning the snake's growing restlessness. Her movements tracked hands through the glass more sharply, and she pressed against the enclosure door more frequently. None of this seemed alarming to them at the time, only signs that the snake was maturing and feeding more aggressively. The reptile room sat above the duplex's living area, warm and poorly ventilated. Faint scents of bedding, disinfectant, and thawed feeders lingered. Evan had cleaned the enclosure earlier, leaving chemical residue on his hands. The python hadn't eaten in 9 days, and Travis assumed the rustling sounds were routine. Burmese pythons are ambush predators that rely heavily on scent, heat, and movement. Even subadults around 10 feet can apply significant pressure, tightening in response to resistance rather than direct aggression. Their feeding response sharpens when food is irregular or when environmental cues, such as body heat or strong odors, mimic prey. In enclosed, warm spaces, misidentification can happen quickly, and without the dramatic displays often shown in media. In the hours leading up to the attack, several subtle warnings were present. The heating pad beneath the enclosure had been inconsistent for weeks, sometimes overheating. The snake had been pacing the enclosure more than usual the night before, and most notably, Evan had cleaned the enclosure without washing the disinfectant fully off his arms before handling her. Travis would later mention that the room smelled strongly of cleaning agents when he entered it that afternoon. Each of these factors contributed to a heightened feeding response state in the python, though none seemed alarming enough for Evan to pause. He had handled her dozens of times without trouble, and experience often breeds misplaced confidence. As Evan lifted the snake from the temporary holding bin to return her to the enclosure, the first coil tightened around his forearm. Evidence suggests she registered the warmth and scent on his skin as prey contact. The sequence happened quietly. A muffled thud traveled through the wall, followed by the scrape of feet against the wooden floor. That was when Travis entered the room. He found Evan partially collapsed against the bed frame, the python already wrapped twice around his torso with a third coil tightening along his upper arm. Travis later described the movements as methodical rather than chaotic. Each time Evan tried to shift or pull away, the snake's grip cinched tighter in short, deliberate increments consistent with constrictor feeding behavior. Her jaw was braced near his elbow, not attempting to bite, but anchoring for leverage. The room was warm, and both men were sweating as Travis tried to wedge a broom handle between the coils. The attempt only triggered additional tightening. The snake responded to pressure with more pressure. Evan's struggle weakened within minutes, his back pinned against the edge of the mattress. The python maintained her position, still coiled, breathing slowly and evenly. Travis called emergency services, leaving the phone on speaker as he continued trying to create space between the coils and Evan's chest. Responders arrived with animal handling tools, cooling spray, and alcohol swabs to disrupt the snake's grip. They worked deliberately, peeling each coil off with coordinated pressure until they freed Evan's torso and removed the final loop from his arm. Evan did not regain consciousness. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene from compressive asphyxia. His phone was found on the floor beside the bed, screen cracked from the initial fall. The temporary holding bin remained open, suggesting he intended only a brief transfer. The python, once fully uncoiled, appeared lethargic from exertion. She was transported to a small rehabilitation facility, where staff noted early signs of metabolic bone disease, likely tied to inconsistent feeder nutrition, and the prolonged temperature issues that had affected her digestion. State agriculture officers later confirmed that Evan did not hold the restricted snake permit required in Ohio for Burmese pythons, and the case was logged as an unregistered ownership violation. The incident stayed local, mentioned only once in a small community paper focused on reptile care safety. Travis later surrendered his own animals, recognizing how subtle husbandry issues can escalate. The bedroom was cleared within days, leaving only faint disinfectant and plywood odors behind. It was March 18, 2014, and the elegant dining room of Robert and Linda Harrison's colonial home in Stamford, Connecticut, was set for an intimate dinner party with Robert's co-workers from the insurance company, where he worked as a senior adjuster. The mahogany table gleamed under the crystal chandelier, while Linda made final preparations for the evening, unaware that Bruno, the 140-pound chimpanzee who had been part of their family for 8 years, was growing increasingly agitated in his basement enclosure as unfamiliar voices filled the house above. At 52, Linda was a recently retired registered nurse who had dedicated her career to caring for others. First her patients, and then Bruno, whom she treated like the child she had never had. She dressed the chimpanzee in human clothes and included him in family activities, despite Robert's growing concerns about Bruno's increasing size and strength. Linda refused to acknowledge that Bruno had become unpredictable and potentially dangerous as he reached full maturity, dismissing his occasional aggressive displays as normal behavior for an intelligent animal. The Harrison home had been extensively modified to meet Connecticut's post-2009 primate regulations, with reinforced enclosures, double lock systems, and secure barriers separating Bruno's living area from the main house. However, Linda had grown increasingly lax about following the strict containment protocols, often allowing Bruno into the main house when she believed no one would discover the violations. Chimpanzees are among the strongest primates on Earth, with adult males possessing the strength of 5 grown men and the ability to inflict devastating injuries with their powerful hands and sharp teeth. Despite their intelligence and capacity for learning human behaviors, chimpanzees remain wild animals with unpredictable temperaments and strong territorial instincts. Adult chimps can become extremely aggressive when they feel threatened or when their social hierarchy is challenged, their attacks often targeting the face, hands, and genitals of their victims with surgical precision. The dinner party had been proceeding normally in the main house with 6 guests enjoying Linda's carefully prepared meal, while Bruno remained hidden in the basement recreation room. However, the presence of strangers in his territory, combined with the sounds of animated conversation filtering down from above, began to stress Bruno beyond his tolerance level. As the evening progressed and wine flowed freely, the dinner conversation became more boisterous, with several guests laughing loudly and gesturing animatedly. The noise carried throughout the house, reaching Bruno in the basement, where his agitation grew with each burst of unfamiliar laughter. Linda had been checking on Bruno periodically throughout the evening, but during her final visit, she found him pacing frantically and displaying clear signs of territorial aggression. The sounds of strangers in his domain had triggered his protective instincts, and his stress levels had reached a dangerous peak that Linda failed to recognize. Instead of immediately securing Bruno in his regulation enclosure or calling for help, Linda made the fatal decision to try calming him with physical contact. She approached the agitated chimpanzee and wrapped her arms around him in what she believed was a soothing embrace, her maternal instincts overriding the obvious danger signals that Bruno was broadcasting. The attack was swift and brutal, driven by instincts that 8 years of human contact had never eliminated. Bruno's powerful hands, each capable of crushing bones, gripped Linda's head and shoulders while his teeth tore into her face, opening severe lacerations across her cheeks, forehead, and around her eyes. The 140-pound chimpanzee's strength was overwhelming, and Linda had no chance to defend herself against an animal that possessed 5 times her physical power. Her screams echoed through the basement and up into the main house, alerting the dinner guests that something terrible was happening below. Bruno's methodical attack continued, his teeth creating multiple deep lacerations across Linda's face and scalp, while his powerful hands struck her head and torso repeatedly. Bruno's hands tore at Linda's face and neck, his powerful fingers severing major blood vessels and causing massive hemorrhaging. When officers finally entered the home, they found Bruno still in the basement with Linda's body, his aggressive posture making any rescue attempt impossible. The chimpanzee was shot multiple times after refusing to retreat, his death adding to the tragedy that had destroyed what should have been a pleasant social evening. Linda was pronounced dead at the scene, having succumbed to severe trauma and blood loss from her extensive injuries. The incident shocked Connecticut's exotic animal community and revealed the ongoing violations of primate ownership regulations that had been implemented following the state's 2009 chimpanzee attack. The 6 dinner guests required extensive psychological counseling to cope with the trauma of witnessing Linda's brutal death, while Robert faced both criminal charges for violating exotic animal laws. It was October 11th, 2015, in the rolling countryside of South Moravia region, Czech Republic. Autumn painted the landscape in brilliant oranges and reds, and morning mist clung to the valleys between ancient hills. The region was known for vineyards and small farming communities, where old stone houses dotted rural roads. Hidden among wooded properties, down a narrow gravel track rarely used by visitors, Kestor Vab had built what he considered his life's work. Kestor was 34 and worked as a freelance wildlife photographer. His passion for documenting animal behavior had taken him across Europe, but his most ambitious project lived at home. For over 15 years, he had raised an adult male chimpanzee from infancy, documenting every stage through thousands of photographs and handwritten behavioral notes stored in stacked binders inside the barn office. The property consisted of a converted barn housing a reinforced indoor enclosure system. Steel bars, layered locks, and climate controls filled the structure. To Kestor, this wasn't just an animal. It was a long-term behavioral study. Investigators later confirmed, however, that the chimpanzee was being held illegally. Regional authorities had received complaints months earlier, and an inspection process had quietly begun after a veterinary supplier reported unusual bulk food orders. Permits for private great ape ownership in the Czech Republic were extremely restrictive, and Kestor's documentation had long since lapsed. He convinced himself the issue was administrative rather than dangerous. In recent months, the chimpanzee had begun displaying escalating dominance behaviors, charging barriers, screaming during feeding, throwing objects, and slamming enclosure doors with startling force. These were signs of adult male maturation and territorial stress. Kestor photographed and logged the behavior, interpreting it as valuable research rather than a warning. On this crisp October morning, Kestor entered the enclosure area alone to perform routine cleaning. The chimpanzee watched silently as he removed soiled bedding and scrubbed feeding trays. The holding gate that normally separated them had not been fully secured, a shortcut he had taken before without consequence. For several moments, the only sounds were the scrape of the brush, the clink of the bucket, and the low, restless shifting of the animal behind him. Chimpanzees are extraordinarily strong for their size, with dense musculature and explosive pulling power that can easily overpower a human. In the wild, conflicts between males often involve biting, tearing, and bursts of extreme violence. In captivity, stress and isolation can intensify these instincts and shorten warning signs before an attack. Their intelligence also makes them unpredictable. Chimpanzees react quickly to perceived threats or intrusion, and attacks when they occur tend to be fast, chaotic, and brutally physical, focused on the face, hands, and other vulnerable areas. As Kestor bent to lift a bucket, the chimpanzee suddenly rushed forward. The impact knocked him backward onto the concrete. Before he could regain balance, the animal seized his right hand and bit down hard. Bones fractured instantly as Kestor screamed and tried to pull away, but the chimpanzee held on, shaking violently. It released his hand only to lunge at his upper body. Teeth tore into his face and scalp in rapid, frenzied bites. Kestor raised his arms to shield himself, exposing his forearms and fingers to further bites and crushing grabs. The chimpanzee clawed and struck wildly, slamming into him as both struggled across the floor. The attack unfolded in seconds of chaotic motion, biting, tearing, and repeated blunt impacts as the animal climbed over him. Deep wounds to his face and neck caused heavy bleeding, while trauma to his head left him disoriented and unable to stand. The concrete floor became slick as he tried to push himself backward, his strength fading. Kestor's movements slowed as blood loss and head injury took effect. His attempts to crawl away weakened, then stopped. The chimpanzee lingered briefly, pacing and vocalizing in sharp bursts, before retreating to the enclosure's far corner, breathing heavily but no longer attacking. Emergency responders later found Kestor unresponsive inside the facility after a delivery driver, unable to reach him by phone, noticed the barn door open and alerted authorities. Despite rapid intervention, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Czech authorities launched a formal investigation, confirming the chimpanzee had been kept without valid authorization and that enforcement proceedings had already been underway. Animal specialists tranquilized the chimpanzee and transferred it to a licensed primate sanctuary equipped for long-term containment and rehabilitation. The coroner ruled the cause of death as severe cranial trauma combined with massive hemorrhage from mauling injuries. Regional media reported the case as a rare but stark example of the risks associated with illegally keeping great apes. It was March 12, 2017, and the morning air hung thick with humidity across the sprawling Castelo Branco estate outside Manaus, Brazil. The previous night's storm had torn through the Amazon basin with unusual ferocity. Fernanda Castelo Branco was a 44-year-old agribusiness heiress who had inherited her family's cattle and soybean empire, spanning over 50,000 acres of converted rainforest. She was known among Brazil's elite for her unconventional lifestyle choices, including maintaining exotic animals on her private compound. She had acquired Onyx, a male jaguar, as a 6-month-old cub from a wildlife trader in 2012, raising him in a custom-built enclosure that occupied nearly 2 acres of her estate. Unlike traditional zoo habitats, Fernanda's design included an outer walking path separated from the jaguar's territory by chain-link mesh, tensioned along a bottom cable and secured to timber posts, allowing her to jog alongside Onyx during her morning exercise routine. Jaguars possess the strongest bite force relative to size of any big cat, capable of exerting over 1,500 pounds per square inch, enough to pierce turtle shells and crush the skulls of their prey in a single bite. Unlike other big cats that typically kill through suffocation, jaguars employ a distinctive hunting method. They bite directly through the temporal bones of the skull or the back of the neck, piercing the brain or severing the spinal cord. These solitary ambush predators can weigh up to 250 pounds and possess muscular builds optimized for explosive power rather than sustained pursuit. The night storm had caused more damage than first visible. A wet Brazil nut branch about 8 feet long had snapped a timber support and loosened a lower tension cable, leaving a 30-inch gap, enough for a jaguar to slip through. Paulo Mendez, the estate's head of security, had begun his 6:30 a.m. patrol and noticed the branch from afar, but hadn't inspected the fence closely. Around 6:40 a.m., Fernanda started her usual jog along the perimeter, wearing bright athletic clothing. Onyx, as usual, followed her inside the enclosure, his powerful form visible through the mesh. Paulo saw nothing unusual and continued toward the main house, losing sight of both. Within minutes, Onyx discovered the gap and slipped through, pushing the mesh aside with fluid silence. In the wild, jaguars stalk patiently before striking, and despite the open lawn, he crouched low, closing to about 30 feet before Fernanda sensed danger. She turned her head just as the jaguar launched forward in a burst of acceleration, his 220-pound frame covering the remaining distance in under 2 seconds. The impact struck her right side with enough force to knock her completely off her feet, her body hitting the ground hard as Onyx's jaws clamped onto the back of her neck, but failed to secure an immediate killing hold. The jaguar's canine teeth, over 2 inches long, punctured through muscle and tissue, seeking the vertebrae with instinctive precision. Fernanda's legs kicked reflexively as she tried to roll away, but the jaguar's weight and grip held her pinned. Onyx released momentarily, then repositioned as the struggle continued, his jaws now targeting her left shoulder. The distinctive crushing bite of a jaguar is designed to incapacitate prey instantly, and each new grip caused catastrophic damage to muscle, bone, and connective tissue. Fernanda managed to brace her right arm against the ground in an attempt to push herself upward, but this movement only triggered another attack. Onyx shifted again, his teeth sinking into her right forearm with enough force to fracture both the radius and ulna. Paulo immediately drew his service weapon and began sprinting toward the scene while shouting commands at the jaguar. The noise caused Onyx to pause and raise his head, blood visible on his muzzle, but he maintained his position over Fernanda's body. Paulo fired one panicked warning shot into the soft ground, then a second. The gunfire finally broke Onyx's focus. As the jaguar began to shift his weight to retreat, he struck the mesh fencing of the enclosure with his shoulder, the collision creating a metallic rattle that seemed to fully break his predatory concentration. He released Fernanda completely and moved back toward the gap in a low crouch, slipping through and disappearing into the interior of his habitat within seconds. Paulo radioed for emergency medical services while simultaneously calling for additional estate security. He approached Fernanda cautiously, confirming Onyx had retreated before kneeling beside her. She remained conscious but was bleeding severely from multiple wounds to her neck, shoulders, arms, and chest. Paulo applied pressure to the neck wound using his shirt while speaking into his radio, providing updates to the arriving security team. The emergency response vehicle arrived approximately 18 minutes after the initial call. Paramedics found Fernanda in shock, with extensive trauma to her upper body. She was transported to a hospital where she underwent emergency surgery, but she died an hour later. Cause of death was recorded as massive hemorrhage and spinal trauma resulting from jaguar attack. The Castelo Branco family immediately ordered the enclosure permanently sealed, and Onyx was sedated and transferred under expedited coordination to a licensed wildlife facility in São Paulo within 48 hours. The estate's veterinarian resigned, citing ethical concerns about the private keeping of apex predators that should have been voiced years earlier.